In modern society, protecting personal rights, especially property ownership, is always a hotly debated issue. The following story will take you through a fierce confrontation between a business owner and a homeowners association HOA in a battle to defend land ownership, something that anyone can face in everyday life. Jacob Ford, a man who has worked tirelessly to build and grow his business, never expected his peaceful life to be threatened by the very community he thought he was a part of. When a decision by the HOA threatened to seize his parking lot without his consent, Jacob was forced to stand up and defend his legal rights, even if it meant facing strong opposition from those around him. This story is not just about a fight to protect property. It is a lesson about power, fairness, and perseverance. Will Jacob be able to reclaim control of his property and protect the business he worked so hard to build? Stay tuned for the next part to uncover the thrilling twists of this story. We would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on this issue. What do you think about personal property rights and the intervention of community organizations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to watch until the end of the story to witness Jacob's decisive actions in his battle to defend his property. What do you do when someone takes something that's yours without asking, without permission, and doesn't even think twice about it? You fight back. Jacob Ford never imagined that his peaceful, hard-earned business would be threatened by the very community he believed he was a part of. His warehouse, which he considered his pride and joy, sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, providing the ideal space for his logistics company. But one morning, Jacob's world was turned upside down. He drove into his parking lot only to find it completely packed, every single space filled with strangers' cars. The issue? These weren't just any cars. They belonged to residents from the nearby community, and they weren't there by chance. The local homeowner association had decided, without consulting him, to turn his private lot into an overflow parking area. And to make matters worse, they thought they'd get away with it. For Jacob, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a fight for his rights, his property, and his business. He wasn't about to let anyone, especially an overstepping HOA, take what was rightfully his. This is a story about standing up when everything seems stacked against you, about proving that sometimes you have to fight for what you believe in, even if it means confronting the very people who should be protecting you. Jacob Ford had barely sipped his coffee when he pulled into the parking lot of his warehouse. It was a typical morning, just like any other, or so he thought. As he rolled in, he noticed something strange. The lot was packed, but not just with a few cars. It was overflowing with vehicles. Cars, SUVs, even a minivan parked haphazardly in spaces clearly marked private property. His first thought was that maybe there was an event nearby, some kind of emergency that had people parking in his lot. But as he slowly drove deeper into the lot, it became clear that wasn't the case. Every single space was occupied. Jacob frowned, his heart sinking. He stopped his truck and got out to take a closer look. He didn't recognize any of the vehicles. They weren't from his staff or delivery trucks. Some of the cars even had stickers from the neighborhood. He was surrounded by strangers. What was going on? He pulled out his phone and dialed Lily, his assistant, who was already inside the warehouse. She picked up on the second ring. "Lily," Jacob said, his voice tight, "did someone authorize parking in the lot? There are a bunch of cars here, and none of them belong to us." Lily's voice crackled through the phone. "No, Jacob, I was wondering the same thing. A few of the guys already called to complain. We've got deliveries coming in today, and there's nowhere for them to park." Jacob sighed, frustration creeping up his neck. "I'm going to check this out. Stay put. I'll call you back." He hung up and made his way to the nearby community center where the homeowner association's office was located. The sun had barely risen, but he could already feel the weight of what he might be walking into. As he approached the pristine community center, with its perfectly manicured flower beds and freshly painted fences, he couldn't shake the sense that something was very wrong. Inside, the receptionist greeted him with a polite smile. "Can I help you, sir?" "I need to speak with someone in charge," Jacob said curtly. "There's a serious issue with my warehouse parking lot. My lot is being used without my permission." "Oh," the receptionist's smile faltered. Let me see if Miss Steele, the HOA president, is available. Please have a seat. A few minutes later, Jacob found himself sitting across from Miss Harper Steele, the HOA president. She was well dressed and confident, exuding an air of authority that made Jacob's frustration even more palpable. He quickly explained the situation, outlining the state of his lot and how it was blocking his operations. "I'm sorry to hear about the inconvenience," Miss Steele said, her tone almost too polite. "But we had to find a solution for the parking issues in the community. Your lot is just sitting there unused most of the time, and we thought it would make a good overflow area." Jacob's jaw clenched. "You thought? Without asking me? That's private property. You can't just decide to use it because it's unused. This is my business, and I need that lot for deliveries and parking for my employees." Miss Steele leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "The homeowner association has the authority to make decisions in the interest of the community. We're doing what's best for the neighborhood. The lot is right next door, and it seemed like a logical choice." Jacob's patience was wearing thin. "A logical choice? This is trespassing. My business relies on that lot. Trucks can't even get in right now because of the cars your residents are leaving there." Miss Steele's expression hardened, but she didn't seem rattled. "We've already notified the residents, and they are following our guidance. I suggest you think carefully about escalating the situation, Mr. Ford. The HOA has resources, and we are acting within our rights." Jacob stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're not within your rights, Miss Steele, and I'm giving you 48 hours to notify your residents and clear the lot. After that, I'm towing every single car. I'm not asking again." The room was tense as Jacob turned to leave, but Miss Steele's words followed him out the door. "I suggest you reconsider, Mr. Ford. This could escalate much further than you think." Jacob Ford stormed out of the community center, his mind racing. How could Miss Steele, with her polished demeanor, be so dismissive of his concerns? The more he thought about it, the angrier he got. She can't just take my property like that. His business, his livelihood, depended on that lot. And now he was being forced into a corner. He pulled out his phone and dialed Lily. The call rang for a few seconds before she picked up. "Lily," Jacob said, his voice sharp, "they're not backing down. Miss Steele had the nerve to say they're acting within their rights." "What?" Lily's voice cracked with disbelief. "That's insane. She can't just take your lot like that." "I know. She said they've notified the residents, and they thought it would be a logical solution." Jacob's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he continued. "I'm giving them 48 hours to clear the lot. If they don't, I'm towing every single one of those cars myself. I don't care what they think." Lily was quiet for a moment. Jacob could practically hear her weighing the situation in her mind. Finally, she spoke. "You've got this, Jacob. They're not going to intimidate you. It's your property, and you've been more than reasonable." He sighed, still reeling from the conversation. "I don't want to escalate things, but this is my business. They can't just walk all over me. I'll give them one last chance to fix it, but if they don't, I'm going through with it." "Call me if you need me," Lily replied, her voice firm with support. Jacob hung up and turned the truck around, heading back to his warehouse. His mind was made up. This wasn't just about cars in a parking lot anymore. It was about standing up for his rights. As he drove, he kept thinking about the residents casually walking in and out of his lot, acting as if they had every right to be there. It made his blood boil. When Jacob arrived at his warehouse, he went straight to the parking lot to take more photos. He made sure to snap pictures of the cars, showing their license plates clearly, and documented the state of the parking spaces. He wasn't taking any chances. The photos would be his insurance if the HOA decided to push back. "All right," Jacob muttered to himself as he inspected the situation. "Let's make sure we're ready." By the time he finished taking the last set of pictures, the lot was still full. The delivery trucks were waiting outside, unable to get in. His employees were getting frustrated too. No one could find a space, and deliveries couldn't be made. Jacob's frustration grew, but he didn't allow himself to act on it just yet. He needed a plan. The next day, Jacob contacted a towing company, explaining the situation in detail. The company assured him that they had handled similar situations before, and everything would be done according to the law. The dispatcher confirmed they'd be able to send trucks the following morning. Jacob spent the evening making sure everything was in place. He printed out new no parking signs in bold, red letters, stating that violators would be towed at the owner's expense. The signs were placed at every entrance to the lot, each one clearly visible. He took pictures of the signs in place as further evidence. The tension in the air was palpable as Jacob reviewed his plans one last time. His employees, many of whom were anxiously waiting for a resolution, were starting to murmur about what would happen next. "Tomorrow's the day," Jacob told Lily that night as they went over everything. "No more waiting. They've had their chance. It's time to make sure this never happens again." Lily nodded, her face set in determination. "I'll be here early with you. We've got this." The morning of the towing operation arrived, and Jacob could hardly contain his anticipation. He stood by his warehouse, eyes scanning the packed parking lot. The tow trucks would be arriving soon, and he knew that what happened next would change everything. He had given the HOA more than enough time to resolve the issue, but they had ignored him completely. Now it was time to act. The first tow truck arrived at 7 a.m. sharp. Jacob was already at the lot, his arms crossed as he watched the truck roll in, its engine rumbling. The driver, a stocky man with a no-nonsense expression, got out of the truck and walked toward Jacob. "You the one calling the shots here?" the driver asked. "Yeah," Jacob replied, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "Get to work. Start with the cars blocking the warehouse doors. We need to clear this out fast." The tow truck driver nodded, already pulling out the necessary equipment. Jacob watched as the first car was carefully lifted from its spot. The chains clanked against the vehicle as it was hoisted up, and Jacob felt a strange mix of satisfaction and anger bubble inside him. It was a relief to see the lot finally clearing, but the situation still left a bitter taste in his mouth. He hadn't wanted it to come to this, but the HOA had left him no choice. As the truck continued its work, more residents began to show up, some walking their dogs, others heading to work. The first woman Jacob saw was in her bathrobe, clutching a cup of coffee. She froze when she saw the tow trucks and then started moving toward Jacob, her eyes wide in disbelief. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice filled with panic. "You can't just take people's cars." Jacob didn't flinch, meeting her gaze. "I'm doing what I have to do. This is private property. The HOA had their chance to fix it, but they didn't. Now I'm clearing my lot." The woman's face turned red with indignation. "But my husband needs that car to get to work. You can't just take it." Jacob's expression hardened. "I've given the HOA 2 days to resolve this. They didn't. If you want your car back, you'll need to talk to the towing company." The woman's hands shook as she turned away, muttering angrily to herself. Jacob didn't let it affect him. He was in the right, and he wasn't going to let anyone intimidate him into backing down. More residents arrived, and with them, more voices of protest. Some were angry, some confused, and a few were downright furious. Jacob remained calm, letting them vent their frustrations. He'd already made his decision, and no amount of yelling or complaining would change that. As he surveyed the lot, Jacob couldn't help but notice the way the residents acted, as if they had some kind of entitlement to his property. Some of them even waved at him as they walked by, as though nothing out of the ordinary was happening. It only fueled his anger further. How can they just ignore the fact that this is my land? Jacob thought. By the time the first few cars had been loaded onto the tow trucks, a crowd had gathered near the entrance. Some residents stood with their arms crossed, shaking their heads. Others argued heatedly with Jacob, accusing him of being unreasonable. But he stayed firm, never once allowing their words to make him second-guess his decision. Then, as if on cue, Jacob saw a familiar face in the crowd, Miss Steele. The HOA president marched toward him, flanked by 2 other board members. Her expression was livid, and she didn't waste any time before confronting him. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice sharp and cutting. "You had no right to tow our residents' vehicles." Jacob stood tall, his stance unwavering. "This is private property, Miss Steele. I've given you 2 days to clear this up, and you didn't. You ignored my warnings, so now I'm enforcing the law." Miss Steele's cheeks flushed with anger, but she refused to back down. "You can't just take the law into your own hands. The HOA has resources, and we'll take legal action if we have to. Jacob shook his head. I'm not taking the law into my own hands. I'm defending my property. You had your chance. Now you'll have to deal with the consequences. One of the board members, a balding man with glasses, stepped forward, trying to mediate. Let's not escalate this any further. Surely we can come to some kind of arrangement. Jacob's patience had run out. No, he said firmly. There's no arrangement to be made. This lot is off limits to your residence, effective immediately. If I see another car here, it will be towed. No exceptions. Steele opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, Jacob turned his back and walked away, signaling to the tow truck drivers to keep working. The crowd of residents was buzzing with anger, but Jacob remained calm. He had made his decision, and he wasn't going to let anyone intimidate him into changing course. As the tow trucks continued their work, he felt a small sense of victory, knowing that he was taking back control of what was rightfully his. The sun had barely risen when the tow trucks rolled in, the sound of their engines reverberating through the quiet street. Jacob stood by the lot, his eyes scanning the vehicles as they were lifted one by one. He had made sure everything was in order. Paperwork, photos, the signs posted at every entrance. He was prepared for whatever came next. The first car was loaded onto the truck with ease, and Jacob couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. Finally, he thought, I'm taking back control. The parking lot, which had been hijacked for days, was now starting to clear, each car that left bringing him closer to a resolution. But the calm didn't last long. A woman, visibly flustered and holding her phone tightly in her hands, marched up to Jacob. You can't just do this. I've been trying to call the HOA all morning. My car's being towed, and I need it. What am I supposed to do now? She demanded, her face red with anger. Jacob looked at her, trying to remain calm. You had 2 days' notice, ma'am, he replied firmly. I've been more than reasonable, and the HOA had their chance to fix this. You'll need to contact the towing company to retrieve your car. She threw her hands up in frustration. I don't care what the HOA did. This is ridiculous. We pay our dues, and this is how we're treated? I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but this is private property. Your HOA overstepped its bounds by using it without my permission. I'm simply enforcing my rights, Jacob said, his voice steady, but his patience starting to wear thin. The woman stood there for a moment, seemingly unsure of what to do. She then stormed off, muttering angrily under her breath. Jacob took a deep breath, trying to shake off the frustration. He couldn't let it distract him from his goal. The tow trucks continued to move quickly, clearing the cars one by one. The lot was starting to empty, and Jacob's sense of relief began to grow. This was the right thing to do. He had made the decision, and now he was seeing it through. As the operation continued, more residents approached, each one as upset as the last. A man with a thick beard and a hoodie came up to Jacob, his eyes blazing with anger. What the hell are you doing? He shouted. Those are my neighbors. You can't just take their cars like this. You're going to regret this, I promise you. Jacob didn't flinch. I'm within my rights, he said calmly. The HOA took advantage of my property, and I gave them more than enough time to resolve it. They chose to ignore my requests, and now the cars are being towed. The man stepped closer, his fists clenched. You better be careful. People don't like being pushed around. You're making a big mistake. Jacob stood his ground, staring the man down. I'm not pushing anyone around. I'm protecting my business, my property. If you have a problem with that, I suggest you take it up with the HOA. The man hesitated, his anger still simmering, but he didn't say another word. Instead, he turned and walked away, still muttering under his breath. As the morning wore on, the crowd around the parking lot grew. More and more residents arrived, some of them fuming, others confused, but Jacob stayed focused. The lot was finally clearing, and he couldn't afford to let the residents or the HOA distract him now. Then, as if on cue, Jacob saw a familiar figure in the crowd. Miss Steele, the HOA president, was striding towards him, her face flushed with fury. She was flanked by 2 other board members, each of them wearing expressions of annoyance. Mr. Ford, she called sharply. What do you think you're doing? You had no right to take matters into your own hands like this. These are our residents' cars. Jacob turned to face her, his stance unwavering. You had your chance to resolve this, Miss Steele. You ignored my requests and continued to let your residents park here without permission. Now I'm enforcing my rights. This is private property, and you don't get to decide how it's used without my consent." Miss Steele's face reddened with anger. "You don't get to dictate what happens in this community. The HOA has resources, and we will take legal action if necessary." Jacob's gaze hardened. "Go ahead. I've documented everything. I'm in the right here, and you know it. The HOA had every opportunity to resolve this peacefully. Now you're going to have to deal with the consequences." One of the board members, a tall man with glasses, stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "Let's not make this worse, okay? We can find a solution. Surely we can work something out." Jacob didn't even give him a second glance. "There's nothing to work out. This lot is off limits to your residents. If I see another car here, it will be towed. No exceptions." Miss Steele's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a tight line. "This is unacceptable. You'll regret this." Jacob turned away, signaling to the tow truck driver to continue. The man's face remained stoic, but Jacob could see the satisfaction in his eyes as the trucks moved to the next vehicle. He had made up his mind, and he wasn't going to back down. As the last of the cars were towed away, Jacob felt a wave of relief wash over him. The lot was finally clear. His business could return to normal. But even as the tension in the air began to dissipate, Jacob knew this was only the beginning. As the final car was loaded onto the tow truck, Jacob stood in the now empty parking lot, watching the last traces of the chaotic situation fade away. The trucks had cleared the lot, and his employees were already moving in, ready to park without issue. For a brief moment, Jacob felt a sense of vindication, a victory. But as he looked around, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Within minutes, the first wave of residents started to show up, their faces filled with confusion and frustration. Jacob was still standing near the entrance, and he saw them walking toward him, some with their heads down, others with clenched fists. The anger was palpable, and he could sense the storm that was about to hit. A man in his 40s, dressed in a work uniform, approached Jacob. His face was red with rage. "You really did it, huh?" he spat. "Took all our cars like they were nothing. Do you have any idea how much of a hassle this is going to be for us?" Jacob took a deep breath, keeping his cool. "I gave the HOA 2 days to resolve the issue. They didn't. This is my property, and I have every right to do what I did." The man's hands balled into fists. "This isn't just about parking. This is about you treating us like criminals, like we don't matter." "I'm not treating anyone like a criminal," Jacob said, his voice firm but calm. "I'm standing up for my rights. Your HOA overstepped, and I'm not going to let that slide." The man glared at him for a moment, then turned on his heel and stormed off, muttering under his breath. But Jacob knew this was just the beginning. The real storm was yet to come. As the day went on, the parking lot remained empty, but the fallout from the towing operation was starting to take shape. Jacob received a barrage of phone calls and messages from angry residents, all demanding answers, all furious with him for what he had done. But the worst was yet to come. By mid-afternoon, a letter arrived at his warehouse. It was from the HOA. Jacob opened it with a mixture of dread and anticipation. He scanned the letter quickly, his eyes narrowing with every word. The letter accused him of causing undue hardship to the community, claiming that his actions had disrupted the peaceful flow of the neighborhood. They threatened to take legal action, demanding that Jacob cease all towing operations and reinstate the parking privileges for the residents. The letter ended with a thinly veiled warning. "This matter is not over, Mr. Ford. You will regret your actions." Jacob threw the letter onto his desk, a cold sense of resolve washing over him. He had expected this. Of course, the HOA wouldn't just let it go. They'd find some way to retaliate, to make him regret his decision. But he wasn't backing down now. Not after everything he had been through. He immediately called his lawyer, a no-nonsense attorney named Grace, to go over his options. Grace had been advising him throughout the whole ordeal, and he knew he needed her guidance more than ever now. "Grace," Jacob said when she picked up the phone, "I just got a letter from the HOA. They're threatening legal action. What do I do?" Grace's voice was calm but firm. "Don't worry, Jacob. You've done everything by the book. They're trying to intimidate you, but they don't have a case. Keep documenting everything and don't respond to their threats directly. We'll draft a formal reply and remind them of their legal overreach." Jacob felt a sense of relief. "I knew you'd have my back. Thanks, Grace." Before the call ended, Grace added, "Just stay alert. They might escalate things, and you don't want to be caught off guard. But if they want to take this to court, we'll be ready." Jacob hung up the phone and sat back in his chair. The day had been long, and the tension was starting to get to him. But he had made it this far. He had stood his ground against the HOA, and he wouldn't let their threats stop him now. As evening descended, Jacob stepped outside to take a final look at the parking lot. The once crowded space was now empty, peaceful. His employees were finishing their shifts, and deliveries were finally moving smoothly again. Jacob allowed himself a small sigh of relief. But deep down, he knew that this wasn't just about a parking dispute anymore. It was about the larger principle, the right to control his property, to protect his business, and to refuse to let anyone take advantage of him. He wasn't just defending a piece of land, he was defending his dignity. The next morning, as Jacob walked into his office, he noticed something strange. Flyers were pasted on every wall. They had the HOA logo at the top and were printed with bold, accusatory text. They claimed that Jacob's actions had endangered the community harmony and encouraged residents to pressure him into reinstating the parking privileges. Jacob ripped one of the flyers off the wall, his anger rising. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was a targeted smear campaign. The HOA was trying to destroy his reputation and intimidate him into giving up. But Jacob wasn't going to let them win. He immediately called Grace again, but this time he was already thinking ahead. "Grace, they've launched a full-on attack. These flyers are everywhere, trying to ruin my business." Grace's response was quick and sharp. "We can hit them where it hurts. If they're defaming you, that's illegal. We'll send a cease and desist letter, and we'll start documenting the impact this is having on your business. They're not just breaking the law, they're trying to destroy you." Jacob's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about a parking lot anymore. This was war. But Jacob Ford had already proven once that he wasn't going to back down, and he wasn't about to start now. The days after the flyers appeared were some of the most tense Jacob had ever faced. The smear campaign orchestrated by the HOA seemed to spread like wildfire. Residents who had once been polite and friendly now looked at him with suspicion. Some sent angry messages, others confronted him on the street. The pressure was mounting, and Jacob knew the fight wasn't over. But Jacob was no stranger to adversity. He had fought for his business, fought for his property, and now he was fighting to protect the truth. He kept his head down and focused on what mattered, his business. Meanwhile, Grace, his lawyer, was drafting the cease and desist letter, and Jacob had started keeping track of the toll the situation was taking on his company. With every insult and every legal threat, the pressure on him only grew, but so did his resolve. One afternoon, a week after the flyer incident, Jacob received an unexpected email. It was from one of the HOA board members, an apology. The email was brief, but the tone had shifted drastically. "Mr. Ford, we regret the way this situation was handled. We understand that the HOA overstepped its bounds and that our actions have caused significant disruption to your business. We promise to revise our policies to ensure this doesn't happen again. Ms. Steele has stepped down, and a new board will be elected shortly. We would like to request a meeting to discuss how we can move forward." Jacob sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. After everything, the confrontation, the threats, the backlash, it seemed almost unreal to read those words. The HOA had finally acknowledged their mistakes, and the president, Ms. Steele, had resigned. A wave of relief washed over Jacob, but there was no time to waste. He immediately called Grace, his lawyer, to discuss the next steps. "They're apologizing," Jacob said, the disbelief still in his voice. "I think we've won." Grace was quick to offer her advice. "It's a victory, yes, but don't let your guard down. Get everything in writing and make sure they follow through with their promises. You've earned this, Jacob, but don't be afraid to stand firm and make sure they make it right." Jacob couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. The fight had been exhausting, and there were moments when he had wondered if it was all worth it. But in the end, standing up for his rights had not only protected his business, it had exposed the HOA's overreach, forced them to acknowledge their mistake, and even led to the resignation of their leader. A few days later, Jacob attended the HOA's board meeting. The room was tense, filled with residents who had been on both sides of the debate. Miss Steele's successor, a new board president named Thomas, addressed the room first. "I understand that we've made mistakes," he began, his voice calm but firm, "and I take full responsibility for the way things were handled. We will do better moving forward, starting with a full review of our policies and an open dialogue with the community. Mr. Ford, I'd like to personally apologize for the disruption we caused, and I want to make sure this never happens again." Jacob stood up, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on him. The tension was palpable, but he was resolute. "I appreciate the apology, but words are just words. It's actions that matter. If this HOA wants to earn back the trust of its residents and businesses, it needs to put people's rights first. I'm glad to see you taking steps to fix the mistakes, but I'll be watching." The room fell silent, and then, unexpectedly, a few residents began to clap. Slowly, more followed, and soon the entire room was filled with applause. Jacob stood there, his chest swelling with pride. He had done it. Against the odds, he had defended his property and his business, and in doing so, he had not only protected his rights, but had also helped to expose a broken system that had taken advantage of the very people it was supposed to serve. As Jacob left the meeting, he felt a sense of finality. The HOA had learned a hard lesson, and so had he. Standing up for what's right wasn't always easy, and it didn't always come without consequences. But in the end, it was worth it. Jacob had fought for what he believed in, and now he had not only reclaimed his property, but had also stood as a reminder that sometimes you have to fight for fairness, no matter the cost. The next morning, as he drove to work, Jacob couldn't help but smile. The parking lot, empty and peaceful, was a symbol of everything he had fought for. And though he knew this wasn't the end of all challenges, it was a new beginning. A beginning where he had learned the true value of perseverance, of standing firm in the face of adversity, and of never giving up on what was rightfully his. And with that, the story of Jacob Ford's battle against the HOA came to a close. But the question remains, in a world where authority often oversteps, how far would you go to protect your rights? Share your thoughts below, and remember, standing up for yourself is always worth it, no matter the odds. In a world where power and corruption often go unchecked, the story of James Parker, a man dedicated to justice, will make you rethink what it truly means to fight for what's right. After years of dismantling criminal empires, all James wanted was peace in his own home. But when he returns to find his life reduced to rubble by the ruthless Clara Henderson, president of the Maplewood Homeowners Association, everything changes. This isn't just about a destroyed house. It's a fight for justice, truth, and holding powerful people accountable. Can James take down the woman who thought she was untouchable? We invite you to follow this gripping tale, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think of Clara's actions? Can James get the justice he deserves? Let us know your opinion, and stay tuned for the next thrilling twist. Imagine this. You've dedicated your life to justice. You've spent years hunting down criminals, dismantling empires of deceit and greed. Every instinct you have is finely tuned to survive in the chaos of danger and high-stakes operations. And after all that, you just want a moment of peace, a quiet weekend in your own home, away from the chaos. Sounds simple, right? But what if, when you return home, everything you've worked for is gone, reduced to a pile of rubble, your life erased in an instant? That's exactly what happens to James Parker. As he turns onto the familiar street that's been his refuge, he feels it, a creeping sense of unease. His gut, honed by years of experience, tightens with dread. Something's wrong. It's the kind of feeling you get when danger's lurking just beyond the horizon. But nothing could have prepared him for what he's about to see. His house, the place where he found comfort after all the chaos. The place that held his memories, his life's work, his soul. It's gone. A bulldozer idles nearby, its operator frozen, staring at the destruction, as if he's just realized he's woken a sleeping giant. The workers move like shadows, avoiding his gaze, their faces pale, understanding that they've just crossed a line they'll never be able to undo. James stands there, shock hitting him like a brick wall. But it's not fear that rises in his chest. No, it's something deeper, more primal. It's a fire, a slow-burning rage simmering under the surface, ready to explode. His fists clench at his sides, not from panic, but from control. He's been trained for chaos, for moments like this. This isn't just about a house. This is about a ruthless woman, Clara Henderson, the president of the Maplewood Homeowners Association. A woman who thought she could play God. She thought she could bulldoze lives without consequence. But she made the worst mistake of all. She bulldozed the wrong house. And now, James is coming for her. He pulls out his phone with the same precision as drawing a weapon. His fingers dial without hesitation, his voice smooth and controlled. "I need to speak to Clara Henderson," he says, and the trembling silence on the other end tells him everything. The woman on the line knows that something bigger is coming. This isn't just a man whose house was destroyed. This is James Parker, a federal agent who doesn't just play by the rules. He is the law. He drives straight to Clara's office, every step calculated, his resolve hardening with every passing second. As he walks into her lavish, pristine office, Clara doesn't flinch at first. She smirks, thinking she's untouchable, that she can intimidate, belittle, and destroy whoever she pleases. But when James steps in front of her desk, everything changes. The air thickens with tension, and the sharp, calculated look in his eyes tells Clara that she's made a grave miscalculation. "You just bulldozed my house," James says calmly, his voice cold and deliberate. The words hang in the air, a challenge. Clara tries to dismiss him, but she can't ignore the truth of his presence. She can't ignore the evidence that James is a force to be reckoned with. And then, as he places the documents on her desk, proof of her corruption, of her crimes, she knows she's in deep trouble. The game has changed, and she is no longer in control. James Parker has come for justice, and Clara Henderson is about to learn just how far he's willing to go to make her pay. James stood in Clara Henderson's office, feeling a mix of disgust and disbelief as he took in the surroundings. The pristine luxury of her office seemed like a direct contrast to the destruction of his life. Clara's confident facade, her ironclad belief that she was untouchable, grated against him. She was sitting behind her mahogany desk like a queen, but James could sense the cracks beneath her poised exterior. The power imbalance that she'd enjoyed for so long was about to shift, and James was determined to make her feel the weight of her actions. Clara's voice broke the silence, dripping with arrogance. "Are you just going to stand there, Parker?" Her eyes narrowed, looking down at him as if he were beneath her. "You think you can intimidate me with your federal agent shtick? I run this neighborhood. I don't answer to anyone." Her tone was condescending, a typical tactic used by people in power to dismiss anyone they deemed inferior. She was used to people cowering, to homeowners begging for her approval, but James wasn't like them. He wasn't fazed by her superficial authority. He didn't care about the money, the power, or the status she held. He cared about justice, and she had made a fatal mistake by underestimating him. James didn't flinch. His voice was measured, every word chosen deliberately. "I don't think you understand, Clara," he said, his eyes steady. "You've crossed a line you won't be able to erase with a few smirks and insults." The tension between them crackled in the air. Clara's confidence faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly regained her composure. This was the first real sign of weakness James had seen in her. He could almost see her calculating how to maintain control, but she didn't realize that control was slipping from her grasp. She leaned back in her chair, dismissing his words with a flick of her hand. "It's just a house, Parker. Get over it. A mistake was made. That's it. Nothing to get so dramatic about." Her words were cold, as though the destruction of James's home was nothing more than an unfortunate mistake, easily brushed aside. But James's pulse quickened, not from anger, but from the chilling realization that Clara had no concept of the magnitude of what she had done. She didn't understand the value of human lives or the weight of a person's memories. To her, it was just business, another transaction in a long line of corrupt dealings. James couldn't let this go. He stepped closer, his presence like a storm slowly gathering in the distance. He was a federal agent, but he wasn't here to enforce the law in the way Clara might have expected. He was here for something far more personal. His voice dropped, the words hanging heavy with the intensity of his conviction. It's not just about the house. It's about what you've been doing behind closed doors, the people you've ruined, the lives you've destroyed. Clara's eyes shifted uneasily. For the first time, she wasn't in control. For the first time, she could see that James wasn't going to back down. He was relentless, and he wasn't going to let her smooth over the destruction of his life with empty words. The air grew tense, thick with the weight of his accusation. The truth was coming for her, and she knew it. But Clara couldn't allow herself to show weakness. She had spent years building this false empire where her word was law, where everyone around her feared her, and the truth had no place. But James wasn't going to let that slide. She forced a scoff, trying to reassert control. Please, save me the hero speech. We both know this is just business. You're not the first person to lose something. People move on. Her words were hollow, an attempt to shield herself from the reality of the situation. She had done this before, silencing people with her indifference and manipulative tactics. But James wasn't one of her easily intimidated homeowners. He wasn't just fighting for a house. He was fighting for every person she had crushed under her heel, for every life she had discarded. And he wasn't going to stop until he had exposed her for what she was. James could feel the weight of the metal box in his hand, each step he took bringing him closer to the inevitable moment of confrontation. The box, he had carried it with him through the wreckage of his life, knowing it contained the truth that could bring Clara Henderson to her knees. His fingers tightened around it as he placed it on her desk with a sharp, deliberate thud. The sound cut through the tense silence that had built between them. Clara's eyes flickered down at the box, and for a moment her mask slipped. The arrogance she had been projecting faltered, and James could see the first true sign of unease in her expression. But she quickly recovered, flashing a brittle smile that barely reached her eyes. "What's this, Parker? A last-ditch attempt to intimidate me?" she asked, trying to mask the nervous tremor in her voice. James didn't respond at first. He simply opened the box with measured precision, lifting out the brittle yellow documents and photographs. As they spilled onto the desk, Clara's eyes darted from one to the next. James knew she would recognize them. Each document, each photograph, was a nail in her coffin. One of the photographs caught her eye immediately. It was an old image of her, standing next to a man James recognized instantly, Gregory Hayes, a notorious real estate developer who had vanished 5 years ago. The image was dated, and there was no mistake. Clara had been involved with him long before his disappearance. The man had been connected to several criminal activities, but his case had gone cold, and no one had been able to track him down. Until now. James watched as the color drained from Clara's face. For a brief moment, she seemed to forget herself. Her composure cracked just enough for him to see the fear beneath the layers of calculated indifference. Clara reached for the photograph, her fingers shaking ever so slightly as she picked it up. You can't," she stammered, but James cut her off, his voice a cold, relentless force. "Oh, I can, Clara. You're the one who can't get away from this," he said, his voice steady, a dangerous calm settling over him. "This is just the beginning." He flipped through the rest of the documents, letting them fall in front of her, the receipts, the transaction records, the property deeds, all connected to homes in Maplewood Ridge, homes that had mysteriously disappeared from the market, owners who had vanished without a trace. Some properties were marked with check marks, homes that had been successfully bought out under Clara's manipulation. Others had a single red X next to them, marking homes where the owners had refused to sell. And then there were addresses crossed out with bold strokes, indicating homes that were taken under more sinister circumstances. Clara's breath quickened as she scanned the papers, her hand moving shakily over the pages as if hoping they would disappear. The room felt suffocating, and James knew she was trying to piece together how much he really knew. But he wasn't done. With a deliberate pause, James pulled out the last item from the box, a bundle of property deeds, followed by a single, crumpled document that caught Clara off guard. It was a list of names, Homeowners, families, people who had disappeared, each one marked with a red X, each name tied to a house lost under her watch. But what really struck Clara was the last name on the list, her own, and there, written next to her name, were the words complicit, final warning. The room was deathly silent now. The realization hit Clara like a freight train. She had been playing a dangerous game, but now it was all falling apart. The walls she had built around her, the lies she had woven, had finally started to crumble. The truth had come for her, and there was no escaping it now. "No," she whispered, barely able to get the word out. You can't do this." Her voice cracked with a mixture of desperation and disbelief. She had been so sure of her power, so confident that no one could touch her. But now her empire of lies was unraveling, piece by piece, and there was no denying the inevitable. James watched her, his eyes hard and unyielding. "You've been running a scam, Clara. You've been taking homes from people, manipulating the system, and covering up disappearances. But you can't run anymore. The FBI is already on its way, and they'll be here soon to deal with you." Clara's face twisted in anger, but there was a hint of something else now. Fear. She had always thought she was untouchable, but this time she had underestimated the consequences of her actions. She leaned forward, trying to salvage something, anything. "You don't know what you're dealing with. You think you've won, but you haven't even scratched the surface. You think you can just walk in here and accuse me? I run this place. I'm untouchable." James's gaze didn't waver. "No, Clara, you're not untouchable, and you're about to find out just how wrong you are." James stood tall, his eyes locked on Clara as she scrambled to recover from the revelation. The pieces were all laid out before her. The stolen homes, the missing people, the shady deals. The truth had come crashing down on her, and there was no way for her to crawl out of this hole. Her world was crumbling, and she knew it. Clara's breathing quickened, and she tried to mask her fear with a sneer, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You really think you've won, don't you?" she said, her voice shaking despite her attempt at bravado. "You think this is over? You think the FBI will actually believe this garbage?" James didn't flinch. His gaze was unwavering, cold and calculating. He stepped closer to her desk, his every movement deliberate, every word a punch landing on her self-delusion. "You've been playing a dangerous game, Clara. A game where you thought you were the puppet master, but now you're the one who's about to be strung up." Her fingers curled into fists on the edge of the desk, her jaw tight with frustration. "I didn't do anything wrong. I built this place, this community. Without me, there would be nothing here. I'm the reason people can live in Maplewood Ridge. I gave them homes." Her voice rose with every word, desperation creeping into her tone. She was trying to convince herself just as much as she was trying to convince him. James let out a slow, controlled breath. "You didn't give anyone anything. You took. You took their homes, their lives, and you buried them so deep that no one would ever find them. You played with people's futures like they were nothing more than pawns. But now, the game's over." The silence that followed was deafening. Clara stood frozen, her eyes darting to the papers on the desk. Her mind was racing, but she couldn't seem to find an escape route. She had been so sure of her invulnerability. For years, she had manipulated the people around her, bending the rules, making the decisions. But now, she was facing the consequences of her actions, and there was no one left to help her. Her voice was a strained whisper, barely audible. "You're wrong. You don't know what you're dealing with." But the words sounded hollow, even to her. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," James replied, his voice sharp. "I'm dealing with a fraud, a liar, a woman who thought she could destroy people's lives without anyone noticing. But you're not going to get away with it, not this time." Clara's eyes were wide now, her chest heaving with panic. She shot a glance toward the door, but there was no one to help her. She had no allies left. Everyone in the building knew the truth now. It was just a matter of time before the FBI arrived. And when they did, her empire would come crashing down. "You're making a huge mistake," Clara said, her voice trembling. "Do you really think you're going to walk out of here and make all this go away? Do you think anyone will believe you? I'm untouchable. I've built this place. I made the rules. You think your little stack of papers means anything? No one cares, Parker. No one." James stepped forward, his eyes burning with quiet fury. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Without a word, he handed it to her, the screen flashing with the image of a federal agent. Clara's eyes widened as she read the name at the top of the screen. Agent Carter. The message beneath it read, "Full-scale operation underway. SWAT teams mobilized, awaiting your signal." Clara's eyes went wide with realization. She had been so sure that she could control the situation, that she could manipulate the narrative. But she had underestimated James Parker. He wasn't just a homeowner looking for revenge, he was a federal agent, and the wheels of justice were already in motion. "You think I'm bluffing?" James asked, his voice a low growl. "You think I'm just some guy who's upset about losing a house?" "No, Clara, this is about something much bigger than that. The FBI is already coming for you, and when they do, it's over. Your little empire is done." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The realization settled over her like a weight, suffocating her. She was no longer in control. Her entire world was about to collapse, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "No," Clara whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, you can't. You can't do this to me. I built this place. You need me. I'm the reason any of this exists." James' gaze softened for just a second, not with sympathy, but with a deeper understanding of how far gone Clara was. "You built nothing. You stole everything. And now you're going to face the consequences. You didn't just steal homes, Clara. You stole lives. You're the one who's been ruining people's futures." Clara's hand trembled as she reached for her desk drawer, her eyes wild with desperation. "I can fix this. I can make it all go away. I can." But her voice trailed off as James took a step forward, blocking her from reaching the drawer. "You're not in control anymore, Clara," he said, his voice cold and final. "You'll never be in control again." The seconds stretched, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. Clara's gaze flickered toward the door again, as if hoping for a miracle. But the truth was undeniable. This was the end. The lies, the manipulation, the destruction. It had all led to this moment. And when the FBI arrived, it wouldn't be just her power that fell. It would be her freedom. The sound of distant sirens echoed through the air, growing louder as the final moments of Clara Henderson's reign came to a close. James stood at the edge of her office, watching as the walls of her empire crumbled around her. It had taken years of manipulation, deception, and unchecked power for Clara to get to this point. But in the end, it only took a few moments of truth to bring it all down. The FBI arrived in force, swarming the building like a well-coordinated storm. Agents flooded the halls, securing every exit, every room, ensuring that there would be no escape for Clara. She stood frozen in the center of her office, her earlier bravado now replaced with the cold reality of her situation. Her empire was gone. Her power had vanished. James watched with a quiet satisfaction as the agents closed in on her. He had been through the chaos of high-stakes operations, the countless hours of risking his life to bring criminals to justice. But this was personal. It wasn't just about doing his job. It was about standing up against corruption, against the abuse of power. It was about making sure that people like Clara Henderson would never be allowed to get away with destroying lives. As Clara was led out of her office, handcuffed and defeated, her eyes locked onto James one last time. She tried to sneer, to hold on to whatever dignity she thought she had left, but there was nothing left for her now. Her time was over. You can't do this to me," she hissed, her voice cracking with desperation. "I built this place. I'm the reason this neighborhood exists. I'm untouchable." James didn't flinch. He had heard it all before, the desperate pleas, the last-minute attempts to salvage what was already lost. He stepped forward, his voice calm and unwavering. "No, Clara, you didn't build anything. You destroyed it, and now you'll face the consequences." As the door to her office swung open, Clara was pushed toward the waiting agents. Her struggles were futile, her words meaningless. She was no longer the powerful woman who once ruled this place with fear and intimidation. Now, she was just another criminal, accountable for her actions, and the truth had come for her at last. James watched her being escorted out, the satisfaction of justice finally settling over him. He had lost everything, his home, his memories, his peace of mind. But in the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that justice had been served, the system had worked, and the corrupt had been brought to their knees. As he turned to leave the building, he looked out over the community that had once lived under Clara's thumb. Maplewood Ridge wasn't perfect. It would take time to heal, to rebuild. But the people here now had a fighting chance, a chance they never would have had if someone hadn't stepped up to fight for them. James couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. This wasn't just about one woman's downfall. It was about the victory of the people. The truth had triumphed, and the system of corruption that had allowed people like Clara to thrive had finally been shattered. And as he walked out into the light, he knew that his work wasn't over. There were more battles to fight, more wrongs to right. But today, at least, he could breathe easier, knowing that justice had been served. The story of James Parker is one of resilience, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Though he lost his home and peace, in the end he gained something far more valuable, a victory for the people. What are your thoughts on James's journey and Clara's downfall? Do you think justice was truly served? Share your opinions in the comments below and join the conversation. Be sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories of courage, justice, and the fight against corruption. In a society where collective decisions can sometimes threaten individual rights, the story of Mark Harris stands as a clear testament to the relentless struggle between personal ownership and the intervention of powerful organizations. Mark Harris, a hardworking farmer, found himself under brutal attack by a community association he never wished to join. Threatening letters, harassment from community representatives, and eventually a fire that destroyed his family's property all seemed to be deliberate steps in a plan to force him to conform. This story is not just about loss, but also about resilience and the determination to defend a life built through hard work. In this battle, Mark is fighting not only for his family, but for his right to live on his terms, despite the external pressure and temptations to give in. Will he be able to defeat those behind the manipulation? Will the community members realize the wrongdoings they've caused? And in the end, will justice prevail? We invite you to join Mark Harris on this dramatic and compelling journey. Share your thoughts in the comments section, and be sure to stay tuned until the end to uncover the surprising conclusion of this fight. You might also find valuable lessons on justice, human rights, and the power of standing up for what you believe in. Mark Harris stood at the edge of his homestead, gazing out over the land that had been passed down through his family for generations. The morning sun cast long shadows across the 10 acres of fertile soil, with the barn standing tall amidst the rapidly developing suburb around it. His fingers brushed the rough surface of the barn door, feeling the weight of the history ingrained in every corner of the property. This was his sanctuary, the place where he had poured his heart and soul into the earth, where his grandfather had toiled before him, and his father before that. It was a simple life, one built on hard work and independence. But it was his life, and it was about to be destroyed. The first encounter had been cordial. The newly formed community association, representing the expanding neighborhood, had knocked on his door with smiles and brochures, inviting him to join their vision of an ideal suburban life. They spoke of shared amenities, lush lawns, and the promise of belonging. Mark listened, but his response was simple. I have everything I need right here. He didn't want their pools, clubhouses, or rules. He didn't need their approval. However, Lisa Carter, the president of the association, didn't take kindly to Mark's refusal. She persisted, her smile stiffening, and her polite suggestions began to feel more like veiled threats. At first, they sent harmless letters, reminding him of the community benefits he was missing out on. But soon, the tone of their messages shifted. Complaints started piling up. His barn didn't meet their standards, his tractor's position was unsightly, and even the animals he cared for became points of contention. Then came the visits. Strangers, clad in business attire, clipboard in hand, started walking the perimeter of his farm, taking notes. They introduced themselves as representatives of the community association, here for a community assessment. Mark's patience snapped. Get off my land, he demanded, his voice hardening. But this was only the beginning. The harassment escalated. Letters turned into threats, initially veiled, then open and direct. If he refused to join, there would be consequences. Mark, resolute as ever, wasn't one to back down. but even he couldn't ignore the growing pressure. As the harassment became more personal and aggressive, it became clear. The community association wasn't just trying to convince him, they were trying to break him. And then, one fateful evening, it happened. Mark arrived home to the faint smell of smoke in the air. His dogs were barking furiously, and as he approached his barn, his heart sank. Flames were already licking at the sides of his beloved barn. Panic set in as he grabbed his phone to call 911, but it was too late. His worst fears had come true. His family's history, his entire livelihood, was being consumed by the fire. By the time the fire department arrived, the damage was irreversible. The barn had been reduced to nothing more than smoldering ruins. As the fire chief spoke to him solemnly, Mark's mind raced. Could the community association really be behind this? Could they have gone that far? In the days that followed, Mark reviewed the footage from his security cameras, his hands trembling as he scrolled through the recordings. That's when he saw it. A shadowy figure moving stealthily toward his barn under the cover of darkness, carrying what appeared to be a gas can. The figure was unmistakable. He recognized that car, the one parked nearby. It belonged to Tom White, a member of the community association who had harassed him just weeks earlier. This wasn't a random act. This wasn't an accident. The fire had been set deliberately. But why? And who else was involved? As Mark stood over the smoldering ashes of his homestead, a burning desire for justice ignited within him. He wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not ever. The battle for his family's legacy had only just begun, and he would stop at nothing to ensure that those responsible for this heinous act would pay. Mark stood in the doorway of his farmhouse, staring down at the freshly delivered envelope. The official-looking letter had the community association's emblem boldly stamped at the top. His heart sank. It was the third one this week, and with each new letter, the tone seemed to grow more hostile. He tore it open and quickly scanned the contents. Another complaint. This time, they claimed that his barn's appearance was unbecoming for the neighborhood. Mark crumpled the letter and tossed it aside, frustration bubbling up, but his resolve remained firm. He wasn't going to let a bunch of people in suits dictate how he should live. Suddenly, a knock came at the door. He opened it to find Lisa Carter standing on the threshold, clipboard in hand, her usual smile plastered across her face. "Mr. Harris, how are you today?" she asked as if nothing was wrong. "I'm doing fine, Lisa, but we need to have a serious conversation about these letters you keep sending me," Mark replied, his tone steady but firm. Lisa stepped forward, her heels clicking on the wooden floor as she entered without waiting for permission. "Mark, we're just trying to help you integrate into the community. You've got a wonderful piece of land here. Imagine what it could be like if you just joined us. The amenities, the sense of unity." "I don't need your amenities," Mark interrupted, his voice sharp. "I don't need anything from you. I've got my farm, and that's enough for me." Lisa's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "Well, I respect that, of course. But I just want to remind you that the association is here for the good of the neighborhood. We want everything to look nice, to work together. Your property, it's not quite up to the standard we're aiming for." Mark's patience was wearing thin. "I've worked this land for decades. My family has worked this land for generations, and you think a few brochures and fancy rules are going to change that? No, Lisa, this is my home, not your perfect little suburban dream." Lisa's eyes narrowed, but she remained composed. "I'm just saying, we could do so much for you, Mark. Your place could look even better, and you'd be part of something bigger." Mark stood his ground, unyielding. "I've already told you. No, I don't want anything from your association, and I don't need your help. Now, if that's all, I've got work to do." Lisa hesitated for a moment, then sighed and checked her clipboard. "I'm afraid we can't let this go, Mark. The community needs to work together, and you're not cooperating. If you don't start following the rules, there will be consequences." "Consequences?" Mark repeated, disbelief creeping into his voice. "What, you think you can force me to join? You can't make me follow your rules. I don't care about your meetings or your clubs. This is my farm, and that's all there is to it." Lisa's eyes flashed with frustration, but she masked it quickly. "We'll see about that. The association doesn't take kindly to people who refuse to comply. I'll be back to discuss this again soon." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Mark standing in the doorway, seething with anger. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. He knew she wasn't going to back down. They weren't going to stop until they had broken him, until they had forced him to bend to their will. That night, as Mark sat on his porch, staring out at the land he loved so much, his mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa's visit wasn't the last. And he was right. The next few weeks were a blur of escalating tension. More letters arrived, each one more insistent than the last. They started complaining about the smallest things. His tractor was parked too close to the barn, the grass was a little too high in certain spots, and there were even complaints about the chickens making noise too early in the morning. It was absurd. One afternoon, as Mark was fixing a fence, he noticed a car pull up just outside his property. He didn't recognize it, but the vehicle parked just at the edge of his land was unmistakable. It was one of the community association's members, Tom White. Tom got out of the car and walked toward the fence, clipboard in hand, surveying the land like it was some sort of crime scene. "Can I help you?" Mark called out, walking toward him. Tom looked up, surprised. "Oh, Mr. Harris, I'm just doing an assessment for the association. We're making sure the neighborhood meets our standards." Mark's eyes narrowed. "I never invited you to come onto my land, Tom. You have no business here." Tom seemed unfazed, taking more notes. "I'm just doing my job. The association wants everything in the area to look nice, and that includes your property." Mark's jaw clenched. "I've told you before. I'm not part of your little club, and I don't want to be. Now get off my land." Tom paused, then sighed, a knowing smirk creeping onto his face. "You'll see, Mr. Harris. The association has ways of dealing with people like you. You can't hide from us forever." Mark's blood ran cold as he watched Tom leave, the words hanging in the air like a warning. Something in the tone of Tom's voice, something cold and final, made it clear that the situation was about to take a turn for the worse. The community association wasn't going to let up. That evening, Mark sat at his kitchen table, as piecing together the string of complaints, the veiled threats, and the subtle intimidation he had faced from the community association. He was no fool. They were getting bolder with each passing day. It was no longer about his barn or his lawn. They wanted him gone. And he had a feeling they would stop at nothing to make that happen. Mark didn't know how far they were willing to go, but he was about to find out. Mark had just finished his work in the fields one chilly evening when he noticed something strange. A new letter had arrived. It was thick, official looking, and carried the unmistakable seal of the community association. He already knew what it would say before even opening it, but the words still hit him like a slap. "Final notice, failure to comply with association rules." He skimmed the letter quickly, frustration bubbling to the surface. It demanded that he address all outstanding violations within 30 days or face further action. The list was as absurd as the last. His lawn wasn't perfectly manicured. There were weeds growing near the fence, and his tractor was unsightly. His blood boiled as he crumpled the paper in his fist. Just then, a knock sounded at the door. Mark opened it to find Lisa Carter standing there, her usual forced smile plastered on her face. Beside her stood Tom White, the man who had once tried to intimidate him with his clipboard. Mark's eyes hardened as he glanced from one to the other. "Good evening, Mr. Harris," Lisa said, her voice sickly sweet. "I trust you've received our letter?" Mark crossed his arms over his chest. "I did, and I'm not going to comply with your demands. This is my property, and I'll maintain it however I see fit." Lisa's smile didn't falter, but there was a coldness in her eyes now. "Mr. Harris, I've tried to be reasonable. We've given you time to adjust, but it seems you've made it clear that you have no interest in being part of this community." Tom stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You're making this difficult for yourself, Mark. We're only trying to help you. The association has resources, and we'd be happy to lend a hand if you just agree to follow the rules." Mark clenched his jaw, his patience wearing thin. "I've already told you, I don't need your help. I don't need to be part of your perfect neighborhood. I've got my farm, and that's enough for me." Lisa sighed, clearly growing frustrated. "Mark, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're not just talking about aesthetics here. Your refusal to cooperate is causing tension in the neighborhood. People are starting to talk." "What people?" Mark shot back, his voice hard. "What are you going to do? Rally the neighborhood against me?" Lisa didn't respond immediately, but Mark could see the wheels turning in her mind. It was clear they were playing a game now, one that Mark wasn't willing to lose. "I'd advise you to reconsider," she said, her voice steely. "The association is well within its rights to enforce these rules. If you continue to ignore our requests, we will have no choice but to take action." Mark stepped back, letting the door swing partially closed. "I've heard enough. Good night, Lisa. Tom." Before Lisa could say another word, Mark shut the door, the finality of the gesture ringing through the air. He leaned against the door, his mind racing. The threats were no longer subtle. They were becoming dangerous. Later that evening, as Mark sat down for dinner, his thoughts kept drifting back to Lisa's words. Take action. What did that mean? He couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to escalate. The next morning, his worst fears began to come true. Mark was out in the fields again, his hands covered in dirt as he worked on repairing the fence, when he noticed movement in the distance. A couple of cars had parked near the edge of his property, and the familiar faces of Lisa and Tom were there, clipboard in hand, as usual. This time, however, there was someone new, a man in a dark suit with a briefcase, looking official. Mark wiped the sweat from his brow, walked over to them and crossed his arms. What's going on now? Lisa's face was unreadable, but there was an edge to her voice. We're conducting another assessment, Mark. The condition of your property has been flagged again. This is a formality. I'm sure you understand. The man in the suit glanced over at Mark and spoke for the first time, his voice clipped and cold. This assessment is mandatory. We need to ensure the value of the community isn't being compromised. Mark's eyes flicked from Lisa to Tom and then back to the stranger. Something wasn't right. The stranger was clearly more than just a member of the association. He seemed like a hired gun, someone brought in to intimidate him further. This is ridiculous, Mark said, his voice steady but angry. You have no right to be here. This land has been in my family for generations. You can't just waltz in and start making demands. Lisa's smile was gone now. Mark, you're not listening. The association will do whatever is necessary to maintain the standards of the neighborhood. You're making things difficult for everyone. Tom, who had been standing off to the side, stepped forward, his voice laced with warning. You've been warned, Mark. We're being patient, but patience has its limits. Mark felt his heart rate pick up, his fists clenching at his sides. It was clear now, this wasn't just about property violations or unsightly barns. This was a campaign of intimidation. I told you before, Mark said, his voice low and steady. Get off my property, now. But instead of retreating, Tom and Lisa exchanged a look, their expressions hard. The man in the suit, who had been standing quietly until now, spoke again. You'll regret this. The association has more power than you think. As the words hung in the air, Mark's anger surged. He turned on his heel, walking back toward his barn, trying to steady his breathing. His land was all he had left, and now it seemed like the community association wanted to take that from him, piece by piece. As he reached his barn, he saw something that made his blood run cold. His mailbox, the one he had just fixed the week before, was now leaning at a strange angle, half destroyed. And worse, there was something on the ground nearby, a broken bottle of red paint, smeared across the dirt. It was a warning, and Mark knew it. They were escalating. He stood there, staring at the mess in front of him, rage building up inside. This was just the beginning, he realized. The community association wasn't going to stop until they had broken him completely. But Mark wasn't about to let that happen, not without a fight. The morning after the destruction of his mailbox, Mark stood in his kitchen, staring out at the scene before him. His gaze shifted to the barn, the place where he had spent so many years building his life with his hands. The red paint on the ground still left a stain in his chest. The mailbox, leaning awkwardly to the side, was the perfect metaphor for what was happening to his life. They were trying to tear him down, bit by bit. But Mark wasn't going to make it easy for them. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, determined to take control of the situation. His boots crunched against the gravel as he walked toward the barn, only to stop short when he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, at the far corner of his property, two figures were walking, Lisa and Tom. They weren't alone this time. Behind them was another person, carrying a clipboard and writing something down. Mark's heart raced as he approached them. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerously calm. Lisa turned to him, the forced politeness in her voice still lingering, though now it felt like a thin veneer over something darker. "Good morning, Mark. We're conducting another assessment. You really need to get these issues under control. This is your last chance to join the association and fix things before it gets ugly." Mark's jaw tightened. "I told you already. I'm not joining your damn association. This is my land. You have no business here." Tom stepped forward, looking uncharacteristically smug. "You don't understand, Mark. The association isn't some small group of people. We have influence. We have support. And we're not going to stop until we've made this place the way it's supposed to be. That includes your land." Mark clenched his fists at his sides. "You think you can bully me into giving up everything I've worked for?" He took a step closer to Tom. "You think this is some game to me?" The stranger, a new face Mark didn't recognize, glanced nervously between the two men before speaking up. "We're just doing our job, sir. This is a community effort. We're trying to make sure everyone's property meets the standard of the neighborhood. That's all." Mark's eyes narrowed. "Your community effort is nothing more than a power grab. You're trying to tear down everything that doesn't fit into your narrow view of what's acceptable." His voice grew louder, more defiant. "I'm not going anywhere." Lisa, sensing the growing tension, stepped forward and placed a hand on Tom's arm, her smile now gone. "Mark, you're making this much harder than it needs to be. We're just trying to help you fit in. You could be a part of something better, something bigger. But if you continue to refuse—" She trailed off, her eyes flashing coldly. Mark's gut twisted as he realized what she was hinting at. "Is that a threat, Lisa?" Lisa didn't flinch. "I don't make threats. But you have to understand, we have the means to make life here very difficult for you." Mark stepped back, his mind spinning. These weren't just idle threats anymore. They were warnings. Real ones. He had already been harassed, had his mailbox destroyed, and now they were trespassing on his property, trying to force him into a corner. This wasn't just about the barn or his lawn anymore. It was personal. They wanted to break him. "I'm not scared of you," Mark said, his voice thick with resolve. "You can keep sending your letters, keep making your assessments, but I will never bow to you. Not ever." Lisa studied him for a long moment before responding. "You'll regret this, Mark. The association doesn't let people like you get away with this. We'll make sure you understand the consequences." Without another word, she turned and walked away, the others following behind her. Mark watched them go, his fists still clenched. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming, something that could change everything. Mark was out in the fields again, working on repairing the fence that had been damaged in the previous weeks. He was used to the hard labor, but today it felt different. The air was heavy, thick with the tension of what had been happening. Just as he was hammering the last nail into the post, a loud crash interrupted his focus. His head whipped around, and his stomach dropped as he saw it. Eggs. Dozens of them, splattered against the side of his barn. The yolks, yellow and sticky, were smeared across the weathered wood, leaving a mess that he knew would be a pain to clean. "Not this again," Mark muttered under his breath. He stormed toward the barn, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just some random act of teenage mischief. It was targeted. It was meant to send a message, and it was clear who the message was from. Mark's mind raced, but his hands trembled with frustration as he grabbed a rag to clean up the mess. As he worked, he couldn't help but think of how far the community association had gone. First the letters, then the trespassing, and now this. They weren't just trying to get him to conform. They were actively trying to destroy him. The next day, Mark installed more security cameras around the barn and other areas of his property. He knew it wouldn't stop them, but at least he would have proof of their actions when the time came, because it was only a matter of time before things escalated further. Later that afternoon, Mark's phone rang. It was Lucy Adams, a neighbor who had always been kind to him. "Mark, I need to talk to you. I've been hearing things. I think you should know." Mark's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What's going on?" "I don't want to get in trouble, but I overheard something at the last community association meeting. Lisa Carter, she said something about taking drastic measures if you don't cooperate. She said they might have to handle it themselves if you won't comply." Mark's blood ran cold. "What does that mean, Lucy?" "I'm not sure, but I think you should be careful," Lucy said, her voice trembling. "They're planning something. I don't know what, but it doesn't sound good." Mark's mind raced. "Thank you for telling me, Lucy. I'm going to be careful. I'll keep an eye out." As he hung up, the gravity of the situation hit him. It was no longer just about property disputes. It was about his safety. And the community association wasn't going to stop until they had destroyed everything he held dear. But Mark wasn't going to let them win. Mark had always believed that he could handle anything. He'd fought for this land, worked it with his bare hands, and fought to keep his family's legacy alive. But nothing had prepared him for what was coming. The vandalism had escalated. His barn had been egged, his mailbox destroyed, and now his once peaceful homestead was starting to feel like a war zone. Every day brought new threats, new attacks. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. That night, after a long day of repairs, Mark sat in his living room, trying to calm his racing thoughts. His phone buzzed, interrupting his silence. It was a text message from Lucy Adams. "Mark, you need to be careful. I overheard Lisa Carter again at the market. She's pushing the board to take more drastic actions. They want you gone, for good." His heart sank as he read the message. He had known things were getting worse, but hearing it confirmed was a cold slap in the face. They weren't just trying to force him to comply, they were trying to destroy him. And the worst part was, Mark didn't know what lengths they were willing to go to. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the barn, the place where everything had begun. The memories of his father working alongside him, teaching him everything he knew, came rushing back. Mark could feel the weight of those memories, the pride, the sweat, the struggle. It was all at risk. Suddenly, a noise broke through the silence of the night, a faint crackling sound like fire. His blood ran cold. Mark grabbed his flashlight and bolted out the door, the sound of his boots pounding against the ground as he rushed toward the barn. His heart was in his throat as he rounded the corner of the building. And then he saw it. Flames. The barn was already engulfed in fire. "No!" Mark screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. He ran toward the barn, but the heat was too intense. He could barely get close before the flames forced him back. The fire raged, devouring everything in its path. His heart ached as he watched the place he had worked so hard to build crumble before his eyes. His mind raced as he fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. "911, what's your emergency?" the operator answered. "There's a fire on my property," Mark gasped. "My barn, it's burning. Please hurry." The fire department arrived within minutes, but by then, the damage was done. The barn was nothing more than a smoldering pile of ash and charred remains. Mark stood there, numb, his hands gripping his knees as he tried to breathe. A fire chief approached him, his face grim. "We're going to investigate, Mr. Harris, but I need to tell you, we're leaning toward this being an arson. The way it started, it looks intentional." Mark's stomach churned. He didn't need confirmation. He had already known. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" the fire chief asked. Mark swallowed hard, his voice steady but filled with fury. "I have a few ideas." The morning after the fire, Mark sat in front of his security monitors, rewinding the footage from his cameras. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that it had been an accident, that it was just a freak occurrence. But deep down, he knew it was no accident. It was planned. He found what he was looking for at around midnight, a shadowy figure, creeping onto his property. The figure moved quickly and silently, carrying a gas can. As the figure approached the barn, Mark's heart raced. He knew that shape. He'd seen that car before. It was Tom White's car. Mark's blood ran cold as he watched the footage. There was no mistaking it. Tom had been there, and now the barn was gone. The evidence was damning. Mark grabbed the footage and rushed to the sheriff's office, his heart pounding in his chest. He burst through the door and walked up to the deputy on duty, slamming the USB drive down onto the counter. "I've got the proof," he said, his voice thick with anger. "Tom White, he's the one who set my barn on fire." The deputy looked at the drive, then back at Mark, his eyes widening in realization. "You're sure about this?" "I'm positive. I've got the footage. He was the one who did it." The deputy nodded, taking the drive. "We'll look into it, Mark. This is serious. We'll get a warrant for his arrest if we can corroborate the evidence." Mark stood there for a moment, his thoughts racing. This was it. He was finally going to take them down. He just had to make sure he had enough evidence to push it through. A week later, after what felt like an eternity, Mark was standing in front of his barn's ruins once again. The fire had taken so much, but it had also sparked something in him, a deep, burning desire for justice. As he stood there, he saw Lisa Carter's car pull up. His blood boiled, but he kept his face neutral as she stepped out, clipboard in hand. She looked at him with an icy smile, but there was something different in her eyes now, a faint glimmer of fear. "Mark," she said, her voice shaky, "I'm sorry about your barn. I truly am. It's tragic." Mark stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Cut the crap, Lisa. I know what happened. I have the footage. It was Tom. He did it." Lisa's eyes darted to the ground. She didn't say anything, but Mark could see the guilt written all over her face. She had been a part of this. She had been pushing for it. "You're all behind this," Mark growled. "You thought you could scare me, break me, force me to join your little club? But you've gone too far. You'll pay for this. All of you." Lisa swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure, but Mark could see her crack. I didn't know it would go this far," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "You should have thought about that before you decided to play God with people's lives," Mark snapped. Lisa took a step back, her hands shaking. I didn't know he would do this. I didn't know." "Then you're just as guilty," Mark said, his voice cold as ice. "You're just as guilty as Tom." As she turned to leave, Mark knew this was far from over. The fight wasn't just about the barn. It was about holding these people accountable for everything they had done, and he wasn't going to stop until he had justice. The days that followed the confrontation with Lisa were a blur of anger and determination. Mark knew the battle wasn't over, but it was getting closer. The proof was on his side. He had the footage. He had the fire chief's assessment. Now, all he had to do was make sure the truth came to light and make the community association pay for what they had done. It wasn't just about the barn anymore. It was about the principle. It was about justice. Mark had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not ever. He wasn't about to let people like Lisa and Tom ruin everything he had built, everything his family had worked for. That evening, Mark sat at his kitchen table, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The sheriff had promised they would investigate, but Mark knew he couldn't rely solely on them. If he was going to win this, he would have to take matters into his own hands. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was Rachel Turner, the attorney he had met after the fire. "Mark, I've got something. It's big." He picked up the phone, his pulse quickening. "What is it, Rachel?" "I've managed to get my hands on some of the internal emails from the community association," Rachel said. "There's more to this than we thought. Lisa Carter and some of the others, they've been discussing your farm for months. I've found email chains where they literally say they need to remove the eyesore." Mark's stomach dropped. "So, they've been planning this all along?" "Exactly," Rachel confirmed. "And I found something even worse. There's a recorded conversation from a meeting where Lisa, Tom, and others are talking about how far they're willing to go to make you comply. One of them even suggests using arson to force you out." Mark's jaw clenched. "So they wanted to burn me out of here from the start. This was never about the rules. It was always about control." Rachel's voice was grim. "We've got enough evidence now, but we need to move quickly. If we can prove that the association had this in mind the entire time, we can destroy their credibility." The next morning, Rachel met with Mark at his property. They walked through the barn's remains, the charred timbers still smoldering. Rachel had a notepad in hand, scribbling down notes as they walked. "Mark, this is it," she said, glancing at the destruction around them. "We've got the proof. The emails, the recordings. They make it clear this was planned, And with the footage from your cameras, we've got the case we need." Mark looked out over his land, the weight of the situation settling on him again. He had spent his entire life here, and now he was fighting not only for his property, but for his legacy. "I'm ready," he said firmly. "Let's take them down." Later that afternoon, Mark and Rachel went to the sheriff's office with their newly gathered evidence. Mark had been told by the sheriff that there would be a follow-up investigation into the fire, but with the new evidence, they now had a solid case. The sheriff was already getting statements from other neighbors who had witnessed the harassment, and the investigation was about to become official. Mark's pulse quickened as the sheriff's deputy handed him a copy of the arrest warrant for Tom White. Tom White is being charged with arson, trespassing, and conspiracy to intimidate, the deputy said. "We've got him. He's going to be arrested this afternoon." Mark felt a rush of relief, but it wasn't over yet. There was still Lisa, still the rest of the association. The next day, Mark stood in front of his barn, his fists clenched as he watched a police car pull up. Out stepped Tom White, his hands cuffed behind him. He was flanked by 2 officers, his face pale and nervous. "Mark," Tom said weakly, his eyes flicking around as he took in the scene, "I didn't think it would go this far." Mark's face remained hard, unmoving. "You should have thought about that before you decided to burn my barn down, Tom. You and Lisa, you were willing to destroy everything for what? To force me to join your little club?" Tom looked down, his expression faltering. "I didn't want this. Lisa, she pushed us all into it. I didn't think it would actually go this far." Rachel stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "You were part of a criminal conspiracy, Tom. You can't hide behind 'I didn't think it would go this far.' The evidence is clear. You planned this. You carried it out, and now you'll have to face the consequences." As the officers led Tom away, Mark felt a strange sense of closure. This wasn't over. It would never be completely over, but it was a victory. However, the real confrontation still loomed. Lisa Carter, the mastermind behind it all, was still out there. She had been the one to push the hardest for the destruction of Mark's farm. She wasn't just a figurehead of the association. She had been the driving force behind it. And Mark was determined to take her down, once and for all. News of Tom's arrest spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some of Mark's neighbors were shocked, others were relieved, but many still whispered among themselves, unsure of where they stood. Mark knew it was far from over. The legal battle was just beginning, but at least now he had the truth on his side. He couldn't change the past, but he could fight for justice. The community association, already on shaky ground, began to fracture. With Tom's arrest, more members came forward, revealing the shady tactics that had been used to try to force Mark out. It was only a matter of time before the entire board would have to answer for their actions. As Mark walked through his property, the memories of his family's legacy grounding him, he knew that his fight wasn't just for his land. It was a fight for something bigger, a fight for his right to live freely, without being bullied by people who thought they could control him. And with that, he felt the first spark of hope. The community association might have tried to destroy him, but it was Mark Harris who had stood firm, and it was Mark Harris who was going to win. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Mark Harris sat in the witness stand, his hands steady despite the weight of what was happening. He had never imagined his life would lead him here, in a battle for his family's legacy, his land, and his freedom. The fire that had destroyed his barn had been the spark that set this entire fight into motion. But now, as the final moments of the trial played out, Mark knew he was on the verge of reclaiming what was rightfully his. The case had gone to court in a dramatic public spectacle. The community association, already reeling from Tom White's arrest and the damning evidence Mark and Rachel Turner had gathered, tried to defend itself with legal jargon and technicalities. But the truth was undeniable. The association had overstepped its bounds, and their manipulation had led to destruction, an innocent man's livelihood destroyed by their greed and control. As the defense attempted to discredit Mark's testimony, Rachel presented the internal emails, the recorded conversations, and the evidence from the fire scene. The jury listened intently as she outlined the deliberate actions taken by Lisa Carter and the others to force Mark into compliance. She painted a clear picture of a calculated conspiracy, one that had gone far beyond simple neighborhood rules. The community they had promised to improve had become a battlefield, with Mark as the unwilling target. Lisa Carter took the stand, her usual confident demeanor gone. She tried to downplay her involvement, but the weight of the evidence was too heavy. Under cross-examination, she faltered. Rachel brought up the recordings from the HOA meetings, where Lisa had suggested extreme measures, including the use of arson, to remove the blight that was Mark's farm. "Do you remember suggesting that Mark's property be made an example?" Rachel pressed. "Do you remember saying, sometimes we have to take drastic measures to protect the community?" Lisa's face turned pale. She stammered, unable to form a coherent defense. "That was frustration," she mumbled, her voice cracking. "It wasn't meant to be taken literally." "Then why did Tom White, one of your own members, set fire to his property?" Rachel's voice was sharp, cutting through the courtroom like a knife. "Why did he follow through on your suggestion?" The courtroom was silent. Lisa had no answer. It was clear now. Lisa Carter and the Community Association had not just been enforcing rules. They had been targeting Mark from the start, using every tactic they could think of to force him into compliance, even resorting to arson to make him surrender. The truth was out, and Mark had won. When the verdict came, it was swift and decisive. The jury found Lisa Carter, Tom White, and several other members of the board guilty of conspiracy, harassment, and arson. The Community Association was ordered to pay $200,000 in damages to Mark Harris, the amount he had originally sought in his lawsuit. The settlement was a relief, but it didn't erase the damage done. Mark stood in the courthouse parking lot, staring up at the sky. It was over. The fight had taken everything from him: his barn, his peace of mind, and the quiet life he had worked so hard to build. But it had also shown him his own strength. He hadn't just fought for his property. He had fought for the right to live on his terms, to protect his legacy, and to stand up to bullies who thought they could control him. The community's reaction was mixed. Some residents who had once been hostile toward him now offered their apologies, realizing how far the association had gone to manipulate the neighborhood. Even Karen, his old friend, came to his side, having recognized the truth and offering her support. "Mark," she said, her voice full of sincerity as she handed him a basket of homemade preserves, "the neighborhood's lucky to have someone like you. You stood up for what was right when a lot of us were too afraid to." Mark smiled, accepting the gift. "Thanks, Karen. It wasn't just about me, it was about all of us. About standing up to injustice." With the settlement money, Mark began the long process of rebuilding. The new barn was sturdier, fire-resistant, and designed to withstand whatever challenges came his way. His equipment was replaced, and the farm slowly began to feel like home again. It wasn't the same. It could never be the same, but it was his. Mark spent the following months not just rebuilding his farm, but rebuilding trust in his community. The HOA, now disbanded and reorganized, had a new leadership, one that was more transparent, more cooperative. The community had learned hard lessons, but they had learned. The scars from the battle remained, but Mark's resilience had become a beacon of strength for others. One autumn morning, as Mark stood on his porch, the vibrant colors of the changing leaves painting the landscape around him, he felt a deep sense of peace. His fight wasn't over, but it had been won. He had defended what mattered most: the land, the legacy, and the principle of standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. The sun set over the fields, casting a warm golden glow across the land. Mark stood there, a man who had fought against an unjust system and emerged victorious. And for the first time in months, he felt hopeful for the future. If this story moved you, what are your thoughts on the fight for justice in this community? Do you think Mark was right to stand his ground, or should he have found a way to compromise? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more inspiring stories that challenge the status quo. Introduction. The battle begins. Imagine this. You've just returned home after a long, grueling day. Your father has just endured yet another round of painful medical treatments, and all you want is to get him inside, let him rest, and perhaps for a brief moment, find peace. But as you pull into your driveway, you see her, Karen, standing there, arms crossed, wearing that infuriatingly smug grin, like she holds all the power in the world. As the president of your homeowners association, HOA, she's no stranger to drama, and today you'll find out just how far she'll go to assert her control. What should have been a quiet, desperate moment of relief will soon spiral into a battle, one you never saw coming. The rules of your neighborhood aren't just about tidiness. With Karen, it's all about power. Are you ready to see how far this power struggle can go? Mark's fight with Karen is just beginning. And trust me, this is a ride you won't want to miss. But what do you think about Karen's overreach? Can she truly justify using her power like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And stay tuned to see how this shocking story unfolds, because you won't believe what happens next. Let's dive in. As soon as Mark stepped out of the car, his father George, still weak from the hospital procedure, leaned heavily on the door for support. Mark tried to steady him, his heart aching at the sight of his father in such a fragile state. They had barely made it to the front steps when they heard a sharp voice cut through the stillness of the street. "That vehicle is a violation of HOA regulations," Karen declared, her arms crossed like a judge ready to pass sentence. Mark froze, the exhaustion of the day weighing heavily on him. "Karen," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, though frustration seeped through. "I've told you before, it's not a commercial vehicle. It's just a plain black sedan. My father is in a wheelchair, and we need easy access to the house." Karen didn't even flinch. She flipped open her laminated HOA booklet, eyes scanning it like a sacred law. "It sure looks commercial to me. Vehicles used for business or any non-residential purpose are subject to immediate removal." Mark's jaw clenched. His father, still gripping the car door for support, looked confused and exhausted, barely able to stand without help. "Can we just deal with this later?" Mark's voice trembled between desperation and anger. "My father just had a procedure. He's not in the condition for this right now." But Karen didn't care. She didn't care about their lives, about his father's health. She was on a mission, and the mission was to uphold her version of the rules, no matter the cost. "No can do," she replied coolly, tapping a finger on her booklet. "The tow truck is already on its way." Mark's stomach dropped. She had already called a tow truck, without giving them a chance to explain. His blood boiled, but he forced himself to stay composed. He couldn't let Karen win, not like this. He turned to George, trying to offer a reassuring smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Dad, maybe we can move the car," he suggested, but he knew his father barely had the strength to stand, let alone walk a few extra feet. "No, don't worry about it," George muttered, trying to keep his voice steady despite the exhaustion in his eyes. Just as Mark was about to respond, the rumble of a heavy engine vibrated through the street. Mark turned toward the sound, his heart sinking even further as he saw the tow truck rounding the corner. The massive vehicle crawled down the road, its bright hazard lights flashing like a warning sign. George let out a weary sigh from the car. "Not this again," he mumbled. The tow truck came to a stop in front of their driveway, and a burly driver hopped out. He didn't even glance at Mark before addressing Karen as if she were his employer. "Which one, ma'am?" he asked, clipboard in hand. Karen smiled smugly, her power trip in full swing. She pointed directly at Mark's car, her finger like a gavel coming down on a guilty verdict. "That one. It's gotta go." Mark stepped forward, anger bubbling to the surface. "You're making a mistake," he said, trying to keep his voice even, but failing. "That's my car. It's not a violation." The tow truck driver looked at him, pen hovering over his clipboard. "You the owner?" Mark took a deep breath, trying to keep calm. "Technically, it belongs to my wife," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "But you really don't want to tow it. Trust me." Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, please, don't start with the excuses. You're the one parking it, so it's fair game." She folded her arms, her smug grin widening as she looked from Mark to the tow truck driver. "Hook it up already." Mark's patience was slipping. His father, still sitting in the car, was watching with growing concern, but Mark couldn't back down. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. "Karen," he said, his voice low but steady, Do you remember when I told you that my wife is an undercover officer? The moment those words left his lips, he saw the flicker of doubt in Karen's eyes. The tow truck driver paused, looking between them. Wait, what? He asked, clearly unsure. Karen's confident smirk faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered, waving dismissively. There are no cops in this neighborhood, she said, almost laughing. You're lying to get around the rules. Mark didn't flinch. Think really carefully about what you're saying, he warned. You're about to cross a line you don't want to cross. Karen's eyes narrowed, her smugness returning. If that's a police vehicle, where's the proof? She challenged. I don't see any badges, no sirens, no markings. It's just a car. And in this neighborhood, the rules apply to everyone. The tow truck driver hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. If it's really an official vehicle, I can't tow it. That's a legal issue. Karen turned on him like a rabid dog lashing out. I told you, it's not a police car. He's just bluffing. Hook it up already. The tow truck driver frowned, clearly uneasy. Listen, lady, if it's really a government vehicle, I'm not losing my job over your HOA drama. Shot him a look of pure disdain. Oh my God, are you serious? This is exactly why we need stricter enforcement around here. People like him always think they're above the rules, always have some made-up excuse. Mark's blood was boiling. His father, who had already been through so much, was being dragged into this petty power struggle. He couldn't let it go any longer. Karen, Mark said, his voice suddenly ice cold, if you so much as touch that tow truck cable, you're going to regret it. For the first time, Karen looked genuinely nervous. Her mouth opened, then shut, but she didn't respond. The tow truck driver, who had been watching this whole exchange unfold, eyed the situation carefully. All right, he said, shaking his head. Someone's paying for my time, or I'm out of here. Karen was still staring at Mark, but the tension was palpable. And then, as if on cue, a miracle happened. The sound of a car engine approaching filled the air. It was Sophie. The sound of Sophie's car engine grew louder, and within seconds, she was pulling into the driveway. Mark felt a wave of relief rush through him. His wife had arrived, and she was the one person Karen couldn't bully. Sophie had always been the calm in the storm, her presence alone capable of diffusing even the tensest situations. As she stepped out of the car, she slid on her sunglasses with the cool confidence only she could pull off. Karen wasted no time. The moment she saw Sophie, her voice cut through the air like a knife. Oh, look who finally decided to show up, she sneered. I was just telling your husband here that he's breaking HOA rules and lying through his teeth. Sophie didn't flinch. She merely raised an eyebrow and took a step closer to the scene. Her eyes flickered briefly to Mark, who was standing firm but clearly worn out by the ongoing conflict. She addressed Karen in a voice as smooth as silk, but there was steel in it that even Karen couldn't ignore. Excuse me? Sophie said, her tone laced with icy politeness. Lying? You're the one who's about to make a huge mistake, Karen. Karen wasn't having it. She turned to the tow truck driver, rolling her eyes dramatically. Can you believe this? He's been standing here claiming that his wife is some kind of officer, but do I look like I'm falling for that? This is just another excuse to get out of following the rules. Sophie didn't respond immediately. She simply took a step closer, her expression unreadable, as though waiting for Karen to dig herself deeper. Then the moment came. Sophie reached into the back pocket of her jeans and pulled out a small leather wallet. She opened it slowly, making sure everyone could see it, and flipped it open to reveal her badge. The metal gleamed in the sunlight, as if the weight of authority clear in its shine. For a split second, there was complete silence. Karen's smug smile faltered, her eyes widening as the realization hit her. The tow truck driver, who had been acting like this was just another routine job, froze in place, his pen hovering in midair. He looked between Karen and Sophie, his face a mix of confusion and uncertainty. Well, well, Karen stammered, her confident stance crumbling. I didn't know you were actually a cop. Didn't give her the satisfaction of a reply. Instead, she simply held Karen's gaze, her expression calm, unyielding. Still think we're lying, Karen? The energy in the air shifted. The neighbors who had begun to gather at a safe distance started murmuring among themselves. Some were whispering in disbelief, others with knowing smiles. Karen had made a serious miscalculation. She had challenged Sophie, and now she was cornered, exposed. The tow truck driver, still trying to process the situation, spoke up cautiously. Listen, I don't know who's right here, but if that's really a police vehicle, I'm not touching it. Karen, however, wasn't backing down. You're all full of excuses, she snapped, her voice rising. This is ridiculous. That's not a police car. It's just some sedan. It's got no markings, no sirens. Sophie took a step forward, her voice calm and even. Actually, it's a fully authorized police vehicle, and you just broke the law by trying to tow it. The tow truck driver, now visibly uncomfortable, looked at Karen and then back to Mark. I can't risk my job over this. If that's a government vehicle, I'm not towing it. Karen's nostrils flared. Her entire demeanor shifted, like a cornered animal ready to lash out. No, 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 you don't understand. She spun around, throwing her hands up in frustration. You're all just trying to get away with it. But Sophie didn't even blink. Let me explain this to you clearly, Karen, she said slowly, as though speaking to a child. You're breaking the law by trying to tow a government vehicle. If you don't stop this, you're going to be in bigger trouble than you can imagine. There was a long pause. The air seemed to thicken with tension. The tow truck driver, still holding his clipboard, hesitated. I'm not touching the car. Not without confirmation, he muttered, shaking his head. Karen looked at him, her face twisted in disbelief. I don't care about your confirmation. I've got rules to enforce, and I'm not going to back down now. She turned back to Mark and Sophie, eyes blazing with fury. You're just trying to cheat your way out of this, but I'm not going to let you. Mark couldn't take it anymore. His voice dropped into a low growl, every word thick with anger and frustration. Karen, he warned, his eyes narrowing, you're making a big mistake. Don't make it worse. But Karen was too far gone. She ignored his warning, her mind clearly set on one thing, winning. You've been lying this whole time, and I'm not going to let you get away with it, she hissed, her voice dripping with contempt. For a moment, Mark thought he might lose control, but then he felt a gentle hand on his arm. Sophie was there, calm as ever, giving him that look, silent, yet full of understanding. She didn't need to say a word. She was in control of the situation. Karen, Sophie said again, her tone never wavering, you've pushed this too far. You'll regret this. The final blow came from the tow truck driver, who, realizing he didn't want to be caught in the middle of this, simply shrugged. Look, I'm out of here, he muttered, turning to walk back to his truck. You want to fight with her? Fine, I'm done. Karen stared at him in disbelief, then turned her furious gaze on Mark and Sophie. You haven't seen the last of this, she hissed, her voice sharp with venom. But Sophie didn't even flinch. You're the one who will regret this, Karen, she said calmly. You're out of line. As the tow truck driver retreated to his vehicle, still muttering under his breath, Karen stood there, seething with frustration. The moment felt almost surreal, like time had slowed down, and every word, every glance felt charged with more meaning than it ever had before. Mark and Sophie exchanged a look, both of them knowing this wasn't over. They had only won a battle in what was about to become a much bigger war. Just when Karen seemed to calm down, though her anger was far from gone, she took one last shot at them. Don't think you've won, you smug little liars, she snapped, her voice barely above a hiss. I'm the president of HOA, and I have the power to make your lives a living hell. You think this is over? It's just begun. Mark's patience was wearing thin. He took a deep breath, stepping forward with quiet authority. You've crossed a line, Karen, he said, his voice steady but firm. You're not just messing with me. You're messing with my father, and that's where I draw the line. Before Karen could retort, George, who had been quietly watching the entire exchange from the car, spoke up, his voice frail but clear. What's the point of all these rules if you don't have any compassion? His words hit harder than anything Mark had said. For a moment, it seemed like Karen might actually reflect on it, but the expression on her face darkened instead. You can try to guilt-trip me all you want, but you don't scare me, Karen spat back. Rules are rules, and I will enforce them, no matter who gets in my way. Mark could see the anger in her eyes, but he also saw something else. Karen wasn't just angry, she was scared. Scared that she might lose control of the power she held over the neighborhood. She had been in charge for so long, and this encounter with Sophie and the tow truck driver had shaken her more than she cared to admit. "What's happening here, Karen?" Mark continued, his voice laced with determination, "is that people are starting to see the real you, and it's not a pretty sight." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Is that a threat?" she sneered. "No," Sophie said, cutting in, her voice calm but piercing. "It's a promise. You keep this up, and you'll have more than just us to deal with. The entire neighborhood is watching you now." Mark didn't know if it was the tension in the air or the fact that Karen was finally being called out for her actions, but something in her seemed to snap. She threw her hands up in frustration, clearly not ready to admit defeat. "You think you can scare me with your empty threats?" she demanded, her voice rising with each word. "You're nothing. I'll find a way to make sure you pay for this." With that, Karen spun on her heel, storming off with a look of pure contempt. But even as she walked away, Mark knew this wouldn't be the last they saw of her. She was a woman who never let go of a grudge, especially not one this personal. The next few days passed in tense silence, but that wasn't the calm before the storm. Oh no, the storm was already brewing. Mark hadn't realized how much Karen had control over in the neighborhood until the violation notices started arriving. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Mark was sorting through his mail when he found it, another violation notice from the HOA. This one wasn't about the car or the ramp, it was about the height of the grass on their lawn. The notice was adamant. Their grass was 0.7 inches too tall. Mark's first reaction was to laugh. "Really? This is what she's doing now?" he muttered under his breath. But his laughter quickly faded when he saw the fine attached to the notice. George, sitting in the living room, looked up when he heard Mark's frustrated sigh. "What is it, son?" Mark waved the paper in front of him. "Another violation from Karen. This time, it's the lawn. She says it's 0.7 inches over the HOA standard, and she's threatening fines if we don't fix it immediately." "Unbelievable," George muttered, shaking his head. "You'd think she'd have better things to do than mess with us." Just as Mark was about to respond, a second letter arrived, this one about their mailbox. The paint had apparently faded too much and didn't meet the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. The penalty? Another fine, along with a demand to repaint it within 72 hours or face more serious consequences. "This is insane," Mark exclaimed. "She's gone off the deep end." Sophie, who had been silently watching the exchange, spoke up, her expression darkening. "She's trying to break us. These fines, they're just the beginning. If we don't stand up to her, she'll make our lives miserable." Mark clenched his fist. "No, I'm not letting her do this. We'll fight back. We have to." And so they did. The final straw came when Karen showed up at their front door one afternoon, her face twisted into a sneer, as she looked down at the wheelchair ramp Mark had built for his father. It was a small ramp, nothing extravagant, but it was a lifeline for George. It allowed him to leave the house and enjoy the fresh air without struggling up the stairs. Karen stood there, arms crossed, her gaze cold. "You've been given plenty of time to remove this unauthorized ramp, and you haven't done it. I'm issuing a fine for this now." "Karen," Mark said through gritted teeth, his voice rising with each word, "you can't keep doing this. The ramp is necessary for my father to leave the house. He's disabled. You can't just keep harassing us like this." Karen didn't flinch. "I don't care about your excuses, Mark. This ramp violates HOA standards, and I'm not letting it slide." That was it. The anger that had been building inside him for days finally erupted. "You're a bully, Karen," Mark said, his voice shaking with emotion. "And I'm done letting you push us around. If you keep this up, you'll have more than just me to answer to." Sophie stepped forward, standing beside Mark, her eyes unwavering. "If you don't stop this, we'll take legal action, and you won't win." For the first time, Karen seemed to hesitate, but only for a moment. Her defiant expression hardened again as she turned and walked away, muttering something under her breath. But Mark knew something had shifted. The battle was far from over. But the power had already started to tip in their favor. The tension reached its peak within 48 hours. Letters piled up, each more absurd than the last. Complaints about everything from grass height to mailbox color flooded their door. But the tipping point came when Karen once again tried to have their car towed for the third time, and this time, the situation went from bad to worse. Things had reached a boiling point. Mark sat at the kitchen table, his hands shaking as he sifted through yet another stack of HOA violation notices. Each one was more absurd than the last. A new rule about the color of their mailbox, the height of the ramp, the type of flowers in their garden, all petty, meaningless things that Karen had latched onto with a vengeance. George, exhausted and drained from the stress, sat in the living room, barely able to keep up with the tension that had clouded the house. "What's next?" Mark muttered to himself. "What else can she possibly complain about?" Just as he said those words, the unmistakable sound of a large engine revving broke through the silence of the afternoon. Mark froze, his heart sinking. Karen had done it again. Rushing outside, Mark was met with the sight of a tow truck creeping down the street, the driver's face set in determination. Karen was standing at the end of the driveway, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with the same smug satisfaction she always carried. Before he could say anything, Karen shot a venomous glare at him. "I warned you," she sneered. "You didn't listen. Now your car's going. Again." Mark's blood ran cold. Sophie was still at work, and George could barely move without help. His father had watched the earlier confrontations unfold from the window, and now Mark could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of everything finally catching up to him. This is it, Mark thought. This is where it ends. Without saying a word, he stepped forward, blocking the tow truck's path. His body trembled with frustration, but he stood firm, unwilling to let Karen ruin his family's life any longer. Karen wasn't having it. "Step aside, Mark. This car is a violation, and I'm having it towed. You're not getting out of this." Mark's voice was low, but his words carried the weight of everything he had endured. "You've been trying to do this for weeks, Karen. I've had enough of your petty games. This ends now." The tow truck driver, now hesitant, leaned out of his window. "Look, I don't want trouble. If this is really a police vehicle, I can't tow it. I'm not losing my job over this." Karen's face turned red with rage. "No, no, you'll tow it or I'll have your job. You hear me?" she screamed. "I'm not letting these people walk all over me." Before she could continue her tirade, Sophie's car rolled into the driveway, her presence cutting through the tension like a knife. The moment she stepped out of the car, Karen's whole demeanor shifted, but not for long. "Oh, look who decided to grace us with her presence," Karen mocked, turning to Sophie with a smug grin. "I was just telling your husband that he's breaking HOA rules again." Sophie didn't respond to the taunt. She walked calmly toward Karen, her posture steady and composed. The entire neighborhood seemed to be watching now, some from behind windows, others lingering on porches, eager to see how this would play out. Karen started again, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What, are you going to claim some new law now? Maybe you'll tell me you're an FBI agent this time? It wouldn't surprise me." Sophie's expression didn't change. With one slow movement, she reached into her back pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. She opened it, revealing her police badge in the afternoon sun. The metallic gleam was unmistakable. The reaction from Karen was immediate. Her face went white as a sheet. The smug grin disappeared, replaced by shock and disbelief. Sophie kept her voice steady, her eyes fixed on Karen. "I've told you before, Karen, this is a police vehicle, and it's not going anywhere. Now, if you still want to make a scene, we can take this to court, but I suggest you walk away." For a moment, Karen stood there, unable to speak, her eyes darting back and forth between the badge and the tow truck driver. The silence in the air was deafening. "What?" Karen finally stammered. You can't, you're lying." Sophie took a step closer. "No, Karen, we're done here. You've made a serious mistake." But Karen wasn't finished yet. "I'm not paying for this," she hissed, turning to the tow truck driver. "You're going to tow that car, and I don't care what she says." The driver, now thoroughly confused, held up his hands. Lady, I'm not getting involved in this. If it's a government vehicle, I'm not touching it. That's the law. Karen's frustration was palpable. She spun on her heel, her face twisted with fury. I'll have you fired, she yelled at the tow truck driver. You'll regret this. But the driver was already backing away. I'm out of here, he muttered, retreating to his truck. You figure it out, lady. The crowd of neighbors, who had been silently observing the entire scene, finally broke their silence. Whispers and chuckles filled the air as they exchanged knowing glances. Karen had lost. The weight of her defeat seemed to crash down on her all at once. She was defeated, exposed, and humiliated in front of the very people she had tried to control for so long. But Karen wasn't the type to go down quietly. As the tow truck pulled away, she stormed off, still muttering under her breath. But something had shifted. Her grip on the neighborhood, the control she'd maintained through fear and manipulation, was slipping away. Mark and Sophie exchanged a glance. This wasn't over. But they had fought back together, and that made all the difference. Within 48 hours, the final blow came. Karen had made one fatal mistake. She had tried to tow an unmarked police vehicle multiple times. The repeated violations caught the attention of local authorities. Within a matter of days, inspectors from the city's housing department appeared at Karen's door, accompanied by officers. The neighbors had begun to take notice. Word spread quickly about the shady practices Karen had been involved in, from unfair fines to fraudulent charges and possible embezzlement of HOA funds. As the city's investigation began to unfold, it was clear that Karen's reign of terror was about to end. A group of officers approached her door that afternoon. The neighbors gathered once more, drawn by the spectacle. Karen tried to slam the door, but one of the officers wedged his foot inside, and before long, she was being escorted out in handcuffs. Her face twisted with fury as she spotted Mark and Sophie standing together on their porch. "This is your fault," she screamed. "You've ruined me. I'll make you pay for this." But Mark stood tall, his expression resolute. "No, Karen," he said calmly. "You've ruined yourself." As Karen was led to the police cruiser, the neighborhood erupted in quiet applause. The long-running nightmare was over. Karen had finally been held accountable for her actions. Mark turned to Sophie, his voice softening. "We did it," he said, a quiet sense of relief flooding over him. Sophie smiled, her eyes filled with a calm victory. "We did." And with that, the nightmare that had haunted their family was over. The neighborhood, once under Karen's oppressive thumb, could finally breathe again. Karen was gone, and justice had been served. The morning after Karen's arrest, Mark and Sophie woke to an eerie silence in the neighborhood. It was the kind of silence that often follows a storm, when the dust settles and people are left to process what just happened. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of peace in the air. Mark sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of paperwork in front of him. The violation notices from Karen, the fines, the threats, it all felt like a distant memory now. But the victory, the relief of knowing Karen wouldn't be able to torment them anymore, hadn't quite sunk in yet. George, still recovering from his medical procedure, had been watching the entire situation unfold from the window, his eyes filled with both worry and hope. After the chaos of the last few days, George finally allowed himself to exhale, his body relaxing for the first time in a long while. The oppressive weight of fear had lifted from his shoulders, even though the scars of Karen's harassment still lingered in the background. Mark looked over at Sophie, who was calmly sipping her coffee, a quiet smile playing on her lips. There was a certain satisfaction in her gaze, a feeling of having done something right. She had been by his side the whole time, not just as his wife, but as a partner who was determined to put an end to Karen's reign of terror. As Mark sat there in silence, a knock on the door broke the moment. It was Emily, one of the neighbors who had witnessed the entire ordeal. She stood there, a hesitant smile on her face, holding a large envelope in her hands. "Hey, Mark," Emily greeted him warmly. I just wanted to check in, make sure everything's okay after all that." "Well, you know everything." Mark opened the door wider, stepping aside so Emily could enter. "Yeah, we're good now." he said with a relieved sigh. It's been a crazy few days, but I think we're finally through it. Karen is out of the picture for good. Emily smiled, but there was a note of seriousness in her voice. Actually, I came to talk to you about that. I know things were tough, and I just wanted to say, well, I'm not the only one who noticed how she treated you. It's been going on for a while. Mark nodded. I know. Karen had been abusing her position as HOA president for a long time. It wasn't just us. There were a lot of people she targeted. Emily handed him the envelope. This is for you, she said softly. A bunch of us neighbors got together. We've been keeping track of the things Karen did, all the way back to when she first started causing trouble. We wanted you to have this. Mark took the envelope and opened it, his heart racing as he pulled out the contents. A series of documents, signed affidavits, and detailed records. It was a collection of evidence from the neighbors who had been harassed by Karen, illegal fines, fraudulent claims, and intimidation tactics. They had gathered it all, and now they were ready to take action. Karen wasn't just messing with us, Emily continued. She's been doing this to others in the neighborhood for years. We've all had enough. Now it's time for her to face real consequences. Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the entire community coming together to fight against the corruption Karen had fostered. He looked over at Sophie, her expression unreadable. She had always known that there was more to the story, and now it seemed like the full picture was finally coming together. What do you want us to do with this? Mark asked, his voice thick with emotion. Emily took a deep breath. We're going to take this to the city's housing authority and the local attorney. We have enough evidence to put Karen in a place where she can't hurt anyone else. Mark's pulse quickened. The weight of the moment hit him all at once. Karen had been the one holding the neighborhood hostage, using her position to control and manipulate. But now, with the collective support of everyone who had suffered because of her, it was time to put an end to her reign. We're with you, said, her voice firm and steady. Let's do this. For everyone who's been hurt. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, legal consultations, and phone calls. Mark, Sophie, and the rest of the neighborhood worked tirelessly to organize their evidence, and it didn't take long for the local authorities to take notice. Karen's shady financial dealings were uncovered. Her misuse of HOA funds became a point of focus, and the fraudulent fines she had imposed on residents were exposed for what they were. Nothing more than an attempt to line her pockets and control others. The community rallied behind Mark and Sophie, offering support in the form of statements, affidavits, and even personal testimonies about the emotional toll Karen had taken on their lives. It wasn't just about the laws being broken. It was about the injustice of Karen using her power to manipulate and intimidate others for personal gain. One evening, after what felt like the 100th meeting, Mark sat down with Sophie at their kitchen table, staring at the stack of papers that had come to define their lives over the past month. We've got everything we need, Sophie said, her voice steady and calm. It's time, Mark nodded. It's time to bring this to an end for good. The day of the court hearing finally arrived, and Mark stood at the front of the courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest. Karen was there too, sitting at the defendant's table with her lawyer, a smug look still on her face despite everything that had come to light. But as the evidence was presented, bank statements, witness testimonies, and financial audits, the truth was clear. Karen couldn't hide behind her rules and regulations anymore. The evidence was irrefutable. The crowd in the courtroom listened in stunned silence as the full extent of Karen's actions was laid bare. Her intimidation tactics, fraudulent claims, and financial mishandlings had been more than just inconvenient. They had been illegal. In the end, the judge delivered a verdict that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Karen was found guilty of embezzlement, harassment, and abuse of power. The community that had suffered under her control was finally free. The neighborhood, once paralyzed by fear, was now a united community, stronger than ever. Mark, Sophie, and George could finally breathe easy. The stress that had weighed them down for so long had been lifted, replaced by the sweet taste of justice. Karen had been held accountable for her actions, and the neighborhood could now flourish without the shadow of her tyranny hanging over them. For Mark and Sophie, the victory was personal, but it was also a testament to the power of standing up against injustice, no matter how daunting the battle seemed. They had fought not just for their own peace of mind, but for the peace of everyone around them. The story ended not with a bitter taste of defeat, but with a hopeful promise that sometimes standing together is the only way to right the wrongs in the world. As the dust settled, Mark and Sophie stood together, looking out over the quiet neighborhood. The streets that had once been filled with tension and fear now seemed calm, almost serene. It was hard to believe that just a few weeks ago, they had been caught in a whirlwind of power struggles, threats, and intimidation. Now, all that remained was the distant hum of life returning to normal. George, who had spent the past few days in recovery, finally felt like he could breathe again. The constant stress that had drained him for so long was gone, replaced by a newfound sense of peace. He sat on the porch, his hands folded in his lap, a contented smile on his face as he watched the sun dip below the horizon. For Mark and Sophie, the victory was bittersweet. They had fought for justice, for their family, and for the neighbors who had been silenced by Karen's reign of terror. But it hadn't been easy. Every step, every decision had come with a cost. The emotional toll, the sleepless nights, the feeling of being constantly watched, it had all weighed heavily on them. But now, as they stood side by side, they knew it had been worth it. Mark glanced at Sophie, her eyes reflecting the quiet triumph of someone who had remained calm in the face of adversity, someone who had never once wavered from what was right. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We did it," he said quietly. Sophie smiled, her voice calm but full of conviction. "We did, but it wasn't just about winning. It was about standing up for what's right, even when it feels like the whole world is against you." As they shared that moment of quiet understanding, the truth of their journey sank in. The battle with Karen had never been just about the fines or the rules. It had been about power and control, and the way people like Karen used that power to manipulate others. It had been about how easily authority could be abused when there was no accountability. And most importantly, it had been about how a single act of resistance, when supported by the truth and the courage of a community, could bring down even the most tyrannical force. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone in the neighborhood who had been too afraid to speak up, too intimidated to fight back. It was a reminder that no matter how powerful someone may seem, they are never above the law, and they are never above the will of a united community. Karen had tried to break them. She had tried to control their lives with rules that served only her own agenda. But in the end, she had failed. The real power had always belonged to the people, those who were willing to stand together, to expose injustice, and to fight for what was right. As Mark and Sophie reflected on the days that had passed, they realized that the journey had changed them. It had tested their patience, their resolve, and their belief in the goodness of people. But it had also reminded them that in the face of adversity, there is always strength in standing up for others. They had been able to protect their family, restore peace to their home, and ensure that no one else would fall victim to Karen's cruelty. The real lesson here was simple. No one should be afraid to stand up for what's right. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones that are fought quietly, without fanfare, without applause. But they are the battles that define us, the battles that shape our communities, and the battles that ultimately lead to a world where justice prevails. Mark and Sophie knew that their fight wasn't over. There would always be more challenges, more people like Karen who would try to push others down. But they had learned something invaluable during this ordeal, that no matter what, they could make a difference. And together, they would continue to face whatever came next, stronger than before. As the stars began to twinkle above, George looked up at the sky, a peaceful smile on his face. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly at home. And for the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt like a place where justice, compassion, and unity would always come first. Mark, Sophie, and George stood together, their hearts lighter, their spirits higher, knowing that they had fought the good fight and they had won. The lessons from this story are both simple and profound. Never be afraid to stand up for what's right, especially when it means protecting your loved ones and fighting for fairness. Regardless of how powerful someone may seem, they are never above the law or the collective strength of those determined to seek justice. Do you believe justice was truly served? How would you have handled this situation if you were in Mark's position? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about courage, justice, and the power of unity. You never know what's coming next. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. The fight for justice is never over. In a seemingly peaceful community where people go about their daily lives under the shadow of unreasonable rules from the HOA, Nathan Daniels, a regular man, finds himself thrust into an unimaginable showdown with imposters posing as law enforcement. The story begins when Nathan, a man who has always followed the rules in his neighborhood, is suddenly confronted by a group of individuals claiming to be from the HOA enforcement unit, accusing him of trivial violations like his mailbox and lawn furniture. What seems like an absurd encounter quickly turns into a larger conspiracy about extortion and fraud disguised as community enforcement. What Nathan and his neighbors experience isn't just a confrontation with fake law enforcement. It's a fight to reclaim justice and expose the corrupt abuse of power within the HOA. The twists and turns in this story will keep you on the edge of your seat, with an explosive climax and the ultimate triumph of standing up for what's right. You won't want to miss the thrilling details in the next part of this story. Be sure to leave your thoughts and opinions about the story in the comments below. Let's talk about how power can be misused and how communities can stand up for their rights. If you're enjoying this thrilling narrative, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on more exciting stories to come. Join us in supporting a community where justice and truth are always upheld. Nathan Daniels was settling into his favorite recliner, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, and the TV remote nestled comfortably in his other. It was a peaceful morning, nothing out of the ordinary, just the way he liked it. But that tranquility was shattered when a loud and aggressive knock echoed through his front door. No one was expected, and certainly not with such force, as though someone were trying to break in. He set his coffee down and walked toward the door, not in a rush, assuming it was just another typical visit. But when he opened the door, what greeted him nearly made him laugh out loud. 3 men stood on his porch, dressed in mismatched uniforms that looked more like something from a costume store than actual law enforcement. They had the posture of a SWAT team about to raid a criminal hideout. The tallest of the trio, a middle-aged man sporting a thick mustache and mirrored sunglasses, stepped forward and flashed a shiny badge that looked more like a toy than anything official. "Sir," the mustached man said in a deep, authoritative voice, "we need you to step outside immediately." Nathan raised an eyebrow and crossed his arms over his chest. "And who might you be?" "We're with the HOA enforcement unit," the man declared, his 2 subordinates nodding seriously behind him. Nathan blinked in disbelief. "The HOA has an enforcement unit now?" he asked, his tone a mixture of curiosity and mockery. "We do," the mustached man replied, lifting his chin. "And we don't tolerate non-compliance." The absurdity of the situation almost made Nathan laugh out loud. He had heard about overzealous HOA regulations, but this was something else entirely. The man reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper, and dramatically unfolded it, reading aloud, "You have been cited for an unapproved mailbox design and unauthorized lawn furniture." Nathan looked at him, blinking in confusion, then glanced over at his perfectly ordinary black mailbox and 2 simple chairs on his porch. "My mailbox?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "What's wrong with it?" "It doesn't conform to the HOA's latest aesthetic guidelines," one of the lackeys chimed in, looking down at his clipboard as if reading from a script. "And my lawn furniture?" Nathan asked, motioning toward the chairs that had been sitting undisturbed on his porch. "It's unapproved," the mustached man stammered, looking down at his paper for any backup. Nathan fought back a smirk. "So let me get this straight," he said slowly. You're trying to arrest me over a mailbox and some chairs? This isn't a joke, the mustached man snapped, stepping forward. Noncompliance with HOA ordinances is a serious matter. You're coming with us. Nathan folded his arms. And exactly where are you planning to take me? To our holding facility, the man replied with a puffed-up chest. At that, Nathan couldn't hold back his laughter. You mean to tell me the HOA has a jail? He asked incredulously. The mustached man's face turned red. It's not a jail, he said through gritted teeth. It's a compliance center. Nathan paused for a moment, rubbing his chin. I see, he said, pretending to think it over. Well, gentlemen, I hate to break it to you, but I'm a little busy today, so I'll have to decline your invitation. The mustached man's patience snapped. That's it, he shouted. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Nathan didn't budge. Or what? He asked, unfazed. One of the lackeys stepped forward, pulling out a cheap pair of handcuffs that looked like they might break if a strong wind blew on them. Do it now, sir, or we'll be forced to take action. Nathan sighed and shook his head. All right, he said slowly, turning slightly. But instead of reaching for a weapon, he reached for the small radio clipped to his belt. With a quick press of a button, he sent out a silent distress signal to his deputies. All without breaking eye contact with the so-called officers. The mustached man grinned, clearly thinking he'd won. That's right, he said smugly. You're learning your place. Nathan didn't flinch. Oh, I know my place, he said quietly. Just as one of the lackeys stepped forward to slap on the flimsy cuffs, Nathan moved in a single swift motion. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it behind his back, and spun him toward the nearest car. The lackey yelped as his face smacked against the hood. The mustached man staggered back, eyes wide with shock. What the hell do you think you're doing? He yelled. Nathan glanced at him, still holding the struggling man in place. Performing a citizen's arrest, he said calmly. The second lackey froze, hand hovering over what was likely another fake citation book or a laminated sheet of nonsense. But before he could act, the sound of sirens grew louder, and real police vehicles skidded to a stop in Nathan's driveway. The three fake officers looked like deer caught in headlights. Nathan leaned in close to the man he had pinned to the hood of the car. Now, let's talk about who's really under arrest. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street as two squad cars came to a screeching halt in Nathan's driveway. The mustached man and his lackeys stood frozen, unable to move, as Deputy Ryan Brooks stepped out of one of the vehicles, hand resting casually on his duty belt. Boss, Ryan called, raising an eyebrow. Mind telling me why you're wrestling with a guy in what looks like a Halloween costume? Nathan finally released the man, stepping back and brushing his hands off. These three were in the middle of conducting an unlawful arrest, he said with a grin. Ryan looked at the trio, then back at Nathan. All right, let's see some IDs. The mustached man tried to regain his composure, but his fake authority couldn't hide for long. This was just the beginning. With the sound of sirens still echoing in the air, the scene had turned from an absurd encounter to a full-blown standoff. The fake officer stood frozen, completely caught off guard by the appearance of real law enforcement. Deputy Ryan Brooks, calm as ever, walked up to the group, his gaze shifting from Nathan to the three men in ridiculous uniforms. Ryan didn't waste any time. Let's see some IDs, he said, his tone matter of fact, as he motioned for the fake officers to hand over their credentials. The mustached man tried to steady himself, his chest puffing out again in a futile attempt to regain some sense of authority. He hesitated for a moment before pulling out a wallet and handing it to Ryan. But the badge inside was laughable, a cheap, poorly engraved piece of plastic that didn't belong anywhere near the law enforcement community. Ryan flipped the badge over, inspecting it closely. HOA compliance officer, huh? You gotta be kidding me, he muttered under his breath. Then he raised his eyes to meet the mustached man's. You're really trying to tell me that's an official badge? The man stammered, but Ryan wasn't having any of it. Which department issued this? Because I've never heard of an HOA compliance division running around like this. The mustached man faltered, glancing nervously at his lackeys. We were authorized by the HOA board to enforce neighborhood regulations, he said, voice wavering. Ryan didn't buy it for a second. He raised an eyebrow. Authorized? And where's the paperwork for that? I don't see anything here that checks out. You're not even registered as security guards, let alone authorized to be playing sheriff. The second lackey, a young man with shaggy hair and a nervous twitch, piped up, trying to salvage the situation. We were told to do this by the HOA. We've got jurisdiction over this whole neighborhood. Ryan gave him a skeptical look, then turned to Nathan. Did you sign off on any of this? Nathan shook his head, his eyes never leaving the fake officers. Not a chance, he said with a firm shake of his head. This is as bogus as it gets. Ryan exhaled slowly, clearly unimpressed. He flipped through the fake IDs, and with every passing second, the tension in the air grew thicker. He turned his gaze back to the mustached man, his voice calm but carrying a sharp edge. So, let me get this straight. You've been running around pretending to be law enforcement, trying to arrest people for imaginary crimes, like their mailboxes and lawn chairs? That's your big plan? The mustached man's face turned red as he tried to come up with a defense. It's not like that. We're just enforcing compliance. People need to follow the rules. Nathan stepped forward, crossing his arms. Enforcing compliance? You're trying to arrest someone for having the wrong mailbox. That's not compliance enforcement. That's just petty harassment. Ryan nodded, a look of disgust on his face as he turned to the second lackey. So, how much were you charging people for these violations? He asked, his voice flat, but with a noticeable edge of disbelief. The lackey shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to respond. He exchanged a nervous glance with the other two, but no one spoke. Nathan raised an eyebrow. No answers, huh? He glanced at Ryan, who shook his head in exasperation. Let's check their vehicle. Ryan didn't wait for confirmation. He walked over to the SUV that had been parked in front of Nathan's house, its bright HOA logo on the side. As he opened the door and rifled through the contents, he let out a low whistle. Well, 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 what do we have here? He muttered, pulling out ticket books, fine notices, and, to his amusement, a small cash box. Nathan joined him, bending over to inspect the items. Looks like someone's been raking in more just HOA fines, he said dryly. This is starting to look like a scam, not a neighborhood enforcement. Ryan closed the door with a click, his expression grim as he turned back to face the fake officers. You know, we're not the ones who've been making threats today, but this sure looks like fraud to me. The mustached man, realizing his grip on the situation was slipping, attempted a last-ditch effort to get out of trouble. We were just following orders. We were told we could issue fines and take whatever we could collect. Nathan narrowed his eyes. Orders from who? The HOA board? The man hesitated, then finally muttered, Yes, the HOA board. We were promised a cut. Ryan's eyes widened as he glanced at Nathan. Looks like we're dealing with a bigger problem than a couple of fake cops, he said. He turned back to the lackeys. Fraud charges are just the beginning, fellas. If you've been threatening people or forcing them to pay up, things are going to get a whole lot worse. Nathan stepped forward again, his voice cold. You've been running a scam, trying to extort homeowners with fines that aren't even real, and you're going to pay for it. The lackeys fidgeted uncomfortably, clearly realizing how badly they'd miscalculated. They had been caught red-handed, and there was no way out. Ryan looked back at Nathan, his expression a mix of amusement and disbelief. You've been getting the short end of the stick here, but I have to admit, this is kind of impressive. Nathan let out a small chuckle. I wouldn't say impressive, just another day on the job. The group of fake officers was about to find out that their little operation was about to come crashing down, and Nathan wasn't about to let them walk away easily. The atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation as the real law enforcement officers closed in on the fake ones. The tension between the two sides was palpable, the standoff now fully escalating into a confrontation neither party could easily walk away from. Nathan, still standing tall and unwavering, glanced at Ryan, who was already preparing to take action. The moment of truth had arrived. All right, let's get to the bottom of this, Ryan said, his voice sharp and controlled. He took another step forward, keeping his eyes trained on the group of imposters. You're not fooling anyone anymore. We're going to figure out who's behind this mess. The mustached man, now visibly sweating, puffed up his chest once again in a desperate attempt to salvage his crumbling facade. He shifted on his feet nervously, trying to regain some control over the situation. "You don't understand," he blurted out. "We've been authorized by the HOA board. We have every right to enforce these rules." Nathan chuckled darkly. His arms still crossed, a look of amusement mixed with disbelief on his face. "Every right?" he scoffed. "You're barely even qualified to stand here, let alone issue arrests. You're not cops, you're criminals playing dress up." Ryan, unimpressed, shot a sharp look at the other two lackeys, who were doing their best to avoid eye contact. "Do you guys really think that pulling off this pathetic impersonation is going to fool anyone? You've got fake badges, a truck full of fraud, and a paper trail that's about as solid as wet tissue paper." The mustached man's confidence faltered. His hands began to shake, and his voice wavered as he stammered. We were just following orders from the HOA board. They promised us a cut. We were told to enforce these rules, and if we didn't, we'd lose our position." Nathan raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed by the fake officer's excuses. "And you thought extorting your neighbors was a smart way to get a paycheck?" He shook his head in disgust. "You're about to learn the hard way that you don't get to pretend to be the law just because someone gave you a badge and a clipboard." Ryan was now fully focused on the trio. "We've got enough evidence right here to put an end to this charade," he said, his tone cold but resolute. "Not only are you impersonating law enforcement, but you're also committing fraud by collecting fake fines. You've broken more laws than I can count." The second lackey, the younger man with a nervous twitch, suddenly stepped forward. "We didn't mean to hurt anyone," he muttered weakly, clearly cracking under the pressure. "We were just doing what we were told. It's not like we knew it would go this far." Nathan's expression turned steely as he stepped toward the man. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You didn't just send fake citations. You threatened people, forced them to pay money for nothing, and you probably ruined some of their lives in the process." The mustached man stepped forward, his hand raised in a futile attempt to regain some control over the situation. "You can't just arrest us. We were doing our jobs. You have no right." Before he could finish, Ryan cut him off with a sharp command. "Enough! You're under arrest for impersonating law enforcement, fraud, and extortion. You've broken enough laws to make sure you won't see daylight for a long time." The two lackeys froze. There was no denying the evidence. Ryan had just delivered the final blow, and there was no turning back now. The mustached man, desperate to escape, made one last attempt at running, but Nathan was quicker. With a swift move, he grabbed the man's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to the ground with a controlled but firm grip. "Nice try," Nathan said with a chuckle, "but you're not going anywhere." Ryan stepped forward, his handcuffs ready. "I've got this one," he said to Nathan, his voice full of quiet determination. He expertly cuffed the mustached man, who was now trembling in shock at how quickly everything had unraveled. The second lackey, who had been looking around for an escape, dropped to his knees, surrendering with a defeated look in his eyes. "Looks like the show's over," Ryan muttered, a satisfied smile creeping across his face as he cuffed the other lackey. "You've played your last act as a so-called officer. It's over." But the situation wasn't over yet. Nathan's gaze shifted to the third and final lackey, the one who had been standing silently, his face pale with fear. The man seemed to realize that there was no way out. His eyes darted between Nathan and Ryan, searching for any escape, but none came. "We didn't mean for it to get this far," the man said quietly, his voice trembling. "We thought we were just helping out, just following orders." Nathan walked toward him, his tone low and unyielding. "Well, you got yourself into a world of trouble by thinking you could get away with this. You didn't just break laws, you hurt people. You're not getting off the hook for that." Ryan stood by, his arms crossed as he watched the final lackey. "You're going to have to answer for everything you've done. No excuses." With the three men now handcuffed and under control, Ryan gave Nathan a nod of approval. "Good work. These guys thought they could get away with something they weren't prepared for. Looks like they're not so tough when they're on the other side of the law." Nathan smirked. "Yeah, well, when you've been on the job long enough, you learn how to spot a fraud. These guys were amateurs from the start." The real police vehicles now fully surrounded the area, and more officers began arriving to assist in the investigation. As Nathan and Ryan prepared to load the fake officers into the back of a squad car, the once bustling neighborhood had quieted down, and the community members were beginning to gather around, eagerly watching the aftermath. One of the neighbors, an older woman, stepped forward and called out, "Sheriff, does this mean we get our money back? They charged us for fines we never should have paid." Nathan turned to her and gave her a reassuring nod. "If you've got receipts, hold on to them. We'll be making sure you get every penny back, and then some." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices lifting in unison. Nathan and Ryan exchanged a glance, both of them silently acknowledging the victory they had just achieved. As the fake officers were loaded into the back of the squad car, their faces filled with disbelief and fear, Nathan felt a sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about arresting a few fake cops. It was about standing up for the community and making sure that no one could exploit others under the guise of authority. It was a small victory, but one that would resonate throughout the neighborhood for years to come. The real police vehicles were fully parked now, their sirens fading into the background as the scene began to settle. The three fake officers, now handcuffed and subdued, were being ushered toward the squad cars by Ryan and Nathan. The entire neighborhood had gathered to witness the drama unfold, the residents whispering to each other, some in disbelief, others in excitement. They had all been victims of the scheme. Some of them had paid thousands of dollars in fake fines for trivial violations, while others had been threatened with even more severe consequences. But now, justice was finally in their hands. As the fake officers were loaded into the back of the squad car, Nathan turned to Ryan, who was busy organizing the paperwork and ensuring everything was documented. The sound of the crowd murmured in the background, but Nathan's focus was on the bigger picture. They had only just begun to uncover the full extent of the scam, and it was much larger than they had initially realized. Ryan glanced up from his paperwork, his face serious. "You know this isn't just going to end with these three," he said quietly. "There's someone pulling the strings behind all of this, and I think we both know who that is." Nathan nodded grimly. "The HOA board. They've been running this show from the beginning. These guys were just the pawns in the game, but the real masterminds are sitting pretty in their offices right now, thinking they're untouchable." Before Nathan could respond, a neighbor stepped forward, holding a small stack of papers. It was an older man with glasses, his face lined with frustration and anger. "Sheriff Daniels, I've got receipts here for all the fines they charged me," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of relief and rage. "I paid them, against my will. These guys told me I'd lose my house if I didn't." Nathan took the papers from him, scanning them quickly. He looked at Ryan, his expression hardening. They were threatening people with foreclosures over lawn furniture and mailbox designs. That's not just extortion. That's an abuse of power. Ryan nodded. "We've got enough to make a case against these guys. But we need more than just the fake citations. We need to bring down the whole HOA board if we're going to end this for good." Nathan's eyes narrowed as he turned back toward the squad car, where the three fake officers were now seated, their faces ashen with fear. "Let's not waste time. We know where this leads. They're not the ones who need to be scared. They're the ones who are going to turn themselves in. The real criminals are the ones with the money and the power." As the squad cars pulled away, heading toward the local precinct, Nathan motioned for Ryan to follow him. The two of them walked back toward the HOA office, their steps quick and purposeful. Inside the HOA building, the mood had changed dramatically. The once confident board members now appeared rattled and anxious. The president, Alan Moore, a thin man with a nervous twitch in his eye, stood at the head of the room, trying his best to maintain an air of authority. But his suit, clearly too large for his frame, and the sweat now glistening on his forehead told a different story. He was no longer the unchallenged leader of the HOA. He was a man who was about to face the consequences of his greed. As Nathan and Ryan entered the room, the board members fell silent, their eyes darting nervously toward each other. Alan Moore took a deep breath and tried to force a smile. "Sheriff Daniels, Deputy Brooks," he said, his voice strained. "This is all a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding?" Nathan cut him off, his voice low and menacing. You've been running a racket, extorting people for thousands of dollars, threatening them with foreclosure over nothing. And now you want to call it a misunderstanding? Allen's eyes flicked toward the other board members, each of them trying to look unaffected, but the tension was obvious. The facade of professionalism was crumbling fast. We were just trying to keep the neighborhood in line. We had complaints, you know. People were not following the rules. Complaints? Nathan repeated, stepping closer. People are forced to pay fake fines for not conforming to some arbitrary standards. You're not running a neighborhood, Moore. You're running a scam. Ryan stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. You're all complicit in this. You signed off on this fraudulent activity. You knew what was going on, and you let it happen. Allen's face turned a sickly shade of pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. It was clear that he had underestimated how far Nathan and Ryan were willing to go to expose the truth. We've got proof, Ryan continued, flipping through the papers they had collected. And it's not just the fake citations. We've got financial records showing how the money from these fake fines was funneled into your pockets. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. This was organized fraud. The rest of the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, no longer looking confident or self-assured. One by one, they realized the full extent of the situation, how their greed had put them at odds with the law. There was no escaping it now. Allen, realizing that the jig was up, slumped back in his chair. He let out a long sigh, his shoulders sagging in defeat. You don't understand, he muttered. We were just trying to keep things under control. People were upset about the lawns, the mailboxes. We thought we could make things better. By scamming people? Nathan asked, incredulity in his voice. You thought extorting them would make things better? Allen stared down at his hands, unable to meet Nathan's gaze. He knew that the game was over, that the consequences were unavoidable. Ryan's voice was firm as he spoke. You've caused damage to this community, and you're going to pay for it. You're all going to answer for this. Allen slowly nodded, his face a mask of resignation. The weight of the situation had finally hit him. The fraud, the threats, the manipulation, it had all come crashing down. And now the board members who had thought they were untouchable would be facing serious legal consequences. Nathan turned to Ryan, his gaze resolute. Let's get them booked. They're not walking away from this. As the board members were handcuffed and escorted out of the room, the neighborhood outside buzzed with energy, their voices rising in relief. Word had spread quickly. Justice was being served. Residents who had once been afraid to speak out now felt empowered. The truth had been exposed, and the criminals behind the fraud were finally being held accountable. Nathan took a deep breath and glanced around at the community, now united in victory. This is what happens when people stand together and refuse to let corruption go unchecked, he said quietly to Ryan. This is what happens when the truth comes out. Ryan grinned. Yeah, and it's about time. You've got a whole neighborhood on your side now. They won't forget this. Nathan smiled, but the weight of the day's events still lingered. Let's just make sure we keep it that way. As the last of the fraudulent HOA board members were led away in handcuffs, the community members began to gather, exchanging stories and celebrating the victory. For the first time in a long while, the people of this neighborhood felt safe, heard, and most importantly, empowered to stand up against those who would abuse their power. Nathan and Ryan had not only stopped a scam, they had restored justice. The neighborhood was buzzing with energy, the air thick with a mixture of disbelief and relief. People had gathered in small groups, sharing their stories, exchanging looks of surprise and joy as they realized that the nightmare that had haunted them for so long had finally come to an end. The oppressive weight of fear that had hovered over them for so long was beginning to lift. Nathan and Ryan stood by, watching the community slowly return to a sense of normalcy. But both knew this victory was more than just about catching a few fake cops. It was about restoring power to the people who had been silenced and bullied by a corrupt system. As Nathan glanced around, he could see the smiles on the faces of the neighbors, a newfound sense of hope in their eyes. A group of older women stood near the front of the crowd, talking excitedly about how they had been forced to pay exorbitant fines for the most ridiculous reasons. A man in a worn baseball cap told the story of how he had been threatened with foreclosure for a perfectly healthy lawn that didn't conform to the HOA's latest aesthetic standards. It was clear that this wasn't just about the fines they had paid or the fake citations they had received. It was about reclaiming their rights, their homes, and their dignity. One of the neighbors, an older gentleman in a faded golf cap, approached Nathan, his voice full of admiration. "Sheriff Daniels, I gotta say, you really turned things around here," he said, his voice warm and appreciative. "If you ever decide to run for office, you've got my vote. This whole town owes you one." Nathan chuckled, shaking his head. "I think I'll stick to law enforcement for now," he replied with a grin. "But I appreciate it." Ryan walked up to join them, his eyes scanning the crowd. "It's not over yet, though," he said, giving a knowing look to Nathan. "We still need to follow the money. Make sure the HOA board doesn't get away with this. There's still a lot of work to be done." Nathan nodded, his expression turning serious. "Yeah, but today we made a dent in their system. These people have been living in fear for too long, and now they know they're not alone." The older man who had spoken earlier, now holding a cold drink in his hand, raised a toast. "To the sheriff and his team," he called out, and soon the whole crowd joined in, their voices rising in unison. "To justice!" The cheers echoed through the neighborhood, and Nathan couldn't help but smile. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. A victory for the people who had been pushed to the brink and were now reclaiming their power. Ryan clapped Nathan on the back. "You know," he said with a grin, "this might just be the most peaceful I've ever seen this neighborhood." Nathan chuckled, looking around at the crowd. "Yeah, but I've got a feeling they'll be keeping a closer eye on the HOA from now on." As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the neighborhood, Nathan felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about the arrests. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter how impossible it seemed. The truth had come out, and the people had been given back their power. The evening air was filled with laughter and the sound of people reconnecting, no longer burdened by the fear that had once held them captive. As Nathan and Ryan walked toward their patrol car ready to head back to the station, Nathan looked over at his deputy and smiled. "You did good today, Ryan. Real good." Ryan grinned. "Same to you, Nathan. Looks like you've earned yourself a place in this community's history books." Nathan gave a small laugh, shaking his head. "I'm just doing my job, but I'll take the credit for this one." As they drove off into the fading light, the last remnants of the day slipping away, the neighborhood began to settle down. The shadows of fear and uncertainty now replaced by a strong sense of community, trust, and resilience. The HOA board and their fraudulent enforcers may have thought they were untouchable, but they had underestimated the power of the people and the law that was there to protect them. Justice had been served, and for once it had been served in full. What do you think about this powerful story of justice being served? How do you feel about the residents' victory over the fraudulent HOA? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave your comments below and let's discuss. And if you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more thrilling tales like this. Join our community where justice, truth, and the fight for what's right are always at the forefront.